The body in the water was not the first, and the man standing over it was not a man. He crouched at the edge of a drainage channel running beneath the port of New York, where the smell of brine and diesel had been layered over something biological and older for long enough that even the rats had relocated. The figure wore a black hood down, despite the cold. And he studied the dead man the way a physician studies a chart, noting what was present, filing what was useful, discarding everything else. The corpse had been a mid-level courier for a procurement network that moved biological samples across 3 continents. His name had been Derek Solis. He had known 17 people by their real names, 42 by alias, and 1 by a code he had never been permitted to write down. Alex Mercer had taken all of it in under 4 seconds. He let the body slip back beneath the surface, watched the dark water close without ceremony, and turned away. What remained of Derek Solis was not wasted. The memories were already sorted, indexed, cross-referenced against what Mercer had pulled from the 2 men before him, a dock supervisor and a freight inspector who had both vanished from their shifts 3 nights ago quietly, without wreckage. The courier was the 3rd link in a chain that stretched east across the Atlantic into a transit network running through Central and Eastern Europe. Someone was moving something valuable along that route. Something requiring the kind of packaging reserved for biological materials, under pressure, refrigerated at specific temperatures, handled only by personnel who had signed documents they could never discuss. Mercer walked out of the drainage channel and into the open air of the port. He moved through the loading area without urgency, hands in the hoodie's front pocket, pace unhurried. A security guard 40 meters away did not look up from his phone. A truck driver climbing into his cab glanced over, registered a figure in dark clothing, looked away. Nothing to mark him, nothing to catch. A predator that announces itself has already made its first mistake. Mercer had not made a mistake in a very long time. From Derek Solis, he had extracted one specific fragment, not a location, not a name, a signature, the shape of a supply chain. The pressure points where security tightened, and where it didn't, the rhythm of trucks leaving the Eastern European hub with documentation signed by people who no longer existed. The load was never listed the same way twice. Temperature requirements were notated in shorthand that changed every 6 weeks. Sample types were coded against a rotating key that only 3 people in the entire network knew how to read. 2 weeks earlier, he had consumed a low-level mold trafficker working out of a shipping container near the South Pier. That man had known almost nothing useful. A drop point, a contact number, the vague awareness someone develops when they are useful to a system, but not trusted by it. But buried in the unremarkable sediment of his daily routine was one thing worth keeping: the Eastern European transit line was heating up. Someone had moved something significant through it recently. The people at the top were using a different grade of packaging, the kind that suggested the contents were not merely dangerous, but worth protecting from other dangerous people. That had been enough to point a direction. Mercer reached the perimeter fence, stepped through a gap that should not have existed. The lock cut cleanly from outside the edges already beginning to oxidize, and walked into the street beyond the port. A taxi moved past. A couple argued in a doorway. The city continued its ordinary operations, entirely unaware that something had been feeding in its underbelly for 3 weeks and was now looking outward toward the continent, toward a transit network, threading through rail hubs and refrigerated truck routes and customs checkpoints, staffed by men who had been bribed so many times they had stopped thinking of it as corruption. He had a direction. He had the shape of the network. He did not yet have the center of it. That would come.
Matsunaga.
The first report reached the BSAA's Northern European Field Office on a Tuesday morning, filed by a logistics analyst who had been cross-referencing cargo manifests flagged for biosecurity irregularities. 4 paragraphs. 3 separate incidents along the Eastern European supply lane. A transport vehicle missing between two checkpoints, two communications officers who had stopped responding to scheduled check-ins, and a storage depot that had transmitted a routine all-clear signal at 2 in the morning, despite having no authorized personnel on site at that hour. The analyst tagged it, Category B reviewed within 72 hours, no immediate escalation. She had flagged 3 similar anomalies in the prior 8 months. 2 had been filed and forgotten. The 3rd had been returned with a note suggesting she recalibrate her threshold criteria. Chris Redfield received a copy anyway, because someone in the field office had learned across several years and several incidents that began exactly this way to copy him on anything that did not make immediate sense. He read it in the back of a transport vehicle moving through Bucharest traffic. His rifle leaned against the seat beside him, a half-finished coffee going cold in his other hand. He read it twice. Each incident had a plausible, mundane explanation. Equipment failure, human error, a guard who had fallen asleep and logged a false clear. But the timing was clean. All 3 had occurred within a 36-hour window spaced along the transit line at intervals that did not look like drift. They looked deliberate, like points selected rather than accumulated. He set the coffee down and pulled out his radio. "Get me Jill." Static then. "She's in debrief, 20 minutes. Tell her to call me when she's out." He kept his eyes on the report and flagged this for the morning briefing. Category A. A pause on the line. The analyst filed it as B Captain. I know what she filed it as. Another pause, the kind that came from someone deciding whether to push back. They decided not to. Understood. He put the radio down and looked out the window at the city moving past. Traffic, pedestrians. The ordinary architecture of a place that had no idea a transit route 200 kilometers north was developing a signature that made the back of his neck tighten in a very specific way. He had felt it before the particular quality of incidents that had been arranged rather than accumulated, the difference between mess and method. The coffee was cold by the time they reached the field office. He left it in the vehicle. The town of Carvis did not appear on most commercial maps. It existed in the administrative records of 2 different municipalities, neither of which claimed full jurisdiction, which meant that in practice, no one did. What it had was a railway spur, a small river, a population of roughly 400 people, who had stopped asking questions about the trucks that came through at night, and a freight handling compound that had changed ownership 4 times in 6 years each time to a company registered in a different country. Mercer arrived on a Wednesday, walking in from the Eastern Road in the gray late afternoon light, wearing the face and gait of a man named Pavel Horta, who had been a shift supervisor at the compound until 40 minutes ago. Pavel had known the entry codes, the staff rotation, the location of the secondary storage area, and the name of the inspector who came to check the temperature-sensitive shipments once per month. He had also known, without fully understanding why he knew it, that the items in the secondary storage area did not appear in any manifest he had ever been permitted to see. The compound sat behind a chain-link perimeter floodlights, already activating as the sky darkened. 2 guards at the main gate. A 3rd visible through the gatehouse window, seated facing a monitor bank. Mercer, wearing Pavel's credentials, carrying his body language, the slight forward lean of a man, tired of doing the same job for 3 years, walked up and nodded at the nearer guard. "Supervisor check, secondary storage." The guard looked at him. Pavel's face, Pavel's voice, the employee ID clipped to the left chest of the jacket. "You're early." "Inventory discrepancy. Need to verify before handoff." The guard glanced at the ID, then toward the gatehouse, then back. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite suspicion, but the particular attentiveness of someone who had just noticed a small wrongness and had not yet decided what to do with it. Pavel's hands, the guard would have known, always carried a plastic coffee cup at this hour. Mercer's did not. "Wait here." He turned toward the gatehouse. Mercer let him take 2 steps, then spoke again, voice exactly level. Kostova already approved it. Check the log if you want. I'd rather not hold up the handoff over a timestamp. The guard stopped, looked back. Kostova was the night shift coordinator. Pavel's memory had supplied the name without prompting, along with the information that invoking it tended to end conversations at this particular gate. The guard's expression settled back into professional indifference. Sign in at the booth. Inside, the secondary storage occupied a space roughly 12 meters by 8, held at 4 degrees Celsius by a refrigeration unit that hummed at a frequency just below noticeable. The shelving along the walls held sealed containers of varying sizes, each tagged with codes that bore no relationship to the main system's manifest. Mercer moved along the shelving, reading each one, not taking them. The structure was more useful than the contents. Near the back, 3 containers sat slightly apart from the rest. Newer, the refrigeration seals, still factory fresh, the handling marks, consistent with long-haul transport. Origin codes on their tags matched a fragment from the dock supervisor's memory. A string of numbers the supervisor had processed hundreds of times without understanding what they referenced. A second data point. The supply chain was longer than one depot. The Eastern European route was transit, not origin. He left the storage, let the door lock behind him, and crossed back through the compound with Pavel's practiced shuffle. At the gate, the same guard looked up briefly. All good. Logging error, already corrected. Outside the perimeter, Mercer walked east along the empty road until the compound's floodlights were a pale smear behind him. He stopped and stood in the dark, processing. 3 clean incidents on the main line, timed and spaced. A transit node running shipments that existed in no official system. Origin codes pointing further east toward a hub he had not yet reached. And the packaging protocols, confirmed now, both in Pavel's memory and in the physical seals, were not standard hazardous materials handling. They were the grade used when the contents were irreplaceable. A truck passed westbound, headlights sweeping across him. The driver did not slow. Whatever was moving through this network had already passed through Carvis days ago. It was continuing west toward a destination he had not determined. He needed someone closer to the chain's center, someone who knew not just what was being moved, but why it required that particular grade of protection. He began walking. Behind him on the road he had just left, the gate guard was writing something in the facility log. A note about a supervisor check routine. Nothing unusual. He initialed it and went back to his phone. In the monitor feed behind him, Camera 7, the one covering the East Road, had recorded an additional 43 seconds of footage before its motion trigger reset. In those 43 seconds, the road was empty. No figure walking east. No movement at all. The guard never checked Camera 7. There was no reason to. Jill called at 9:47 Eastern European time. Chris picked up on the second ring. You saw the report, he said. Just finished. Her voice was measured, the tone of someone building a picture rather than reacting to one. 3 incidents, 36 hours, same supply lane. The spacing bothers me. The spacing is the least of it. A beat. It's not just careful. Whatever moved through there was selecting its contact points. The vehicle, the comms officers, the depot signal, those aren't random touches. Each one removed a specific layer of visibility. Chris looked at the map on the table. The 3 markers. The long line of territory between them. You're saying it knew what it was erasing. I'm saying it chose what not to leave behind. That's different from being careful. Careful is a person. This is something that understood the system it was moving through. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain had started against the field office window, moving in long diagonal lines through the streetlight. I want you on the secondary nodes, not the main line. Already my first call. She paused. 36 hours? 36. She hung up without further comment. Chris stood at the window watching the rain. Something had moved through that transit network with enough precision to dismantle its own trail and enough restraint to leave just enough behind. Just enough for a good analyst to flag, just enough for a field office to receive, just enough for one person with the right kind of experience to call it a Category A instead of filing it away. Just enough to be seen if someone was looking in the right direction. He did not know yet whether that was an accident or an invitation. The rain continued. The coffee he had poured an hour ago sat cold on the desk behind him, untouched. The man Mercer needed was named Vasek Oren. And Vasek Oren was careful in the specific way that people become careful when they have been close to dangerous things long enough to understand that dangerous things have memories. He worked as a regional coordination officer for a logistics firm that did not appear in any public registry, operating out of a mid-floor office in a commercial building large enough that quiet men in mid-floor offices were unremarkable. His official title on the building's tenant list was procurement consultant. His actual function was to manage the flow of communication between 3 separate freight channels: the official BSAA, adjacent lane, the black market stream that fed off it like a parasite, and a third line that neither of the other 2 officially knew existed. Vasek had reach into all 3. He was in the architecture of this particular web, a junction point, the kind of node where information from multiple directions converged before being sorted and passed upward. He was also, which Mercer had established from 2 prior consumes, lower in the chain, the first person in the entire structure who actually knew what category of material was moving through the third line. Not its origin, not its destination, but its classification, the handling tier, the containment requirements, the specific internal phrase used to flag it as something that could not be replicated. Mercer had been watching him for 18 hours. Vasek's day had structure. He arrived at the building at 8:45, took the elevator to the 7th floor. Spent 6 hours at his desk, ate lunch at a place 2 blocks north he had frequented for 4 years. Returned and worked until 7, then took a different route home each night. Not randomly different, but systematically different, rotating through 4 alternating paths on a 9-day cycle. The 9-day cycle was not coincidence. It was the kind of operational discipline someone teaches you, not something you develop alone. On the morning of the 19th, Mercer took the elevator to the 6th floor. He was wearing the face of a building maintenance worker named Broad, a man assigned to the HVAC system on alternating Tuesdays, whose keycard granted entry to the service corridors on floors 5 through 8. Broad had never spoken to Vasek Oren, but Broad's card had been logged entering the 7th floor service corridor during Vasek's working hours on 3 prior occasions, which meant a maintenance presence on that floor was not anomalous. The service corridor behind Vasek's office had a ventilation panel. From the other side of it, in a space that smelled of insulation and recycled air, Mercer listened. Vasek was on the phone. The conversation moved between Czech and English, with one phrase repeated twice in German. Close enough to the second key has not arrived. The English portions were the useful part. Mercer cataloged them, a transfer authorization code read aloud. A temperature specification confirmed 3 times a reference to a container classification. Vasek called only by a 2-letter prefix that matched nothing in the freight lexicon absorbed from prior consumes. The call ended. Vasek sat in silence for 11 seconds. Then from somewhere in the room, a drawer, a cabinet. Mercer could not see from his angle, came the sound of a combination being entered on a physical lock. 3 tones. A brief mechanical release. Then nothing. Whatever Vasek had opened, he did not leave it open long. Mercer stayed still, noted the sound, filed it. A second call followed shorter to a number Vasek did not look up. 3 sentences. Confirmation that a handoff scheduled for the following week was being moved forward. Confirmation that the receiving node would be ready, and a final sentence quiet enough that Mercer had to filter it from the building's ambient noise. Tell them it cannot travel with the others. It goes separately, or it does not go. He stayed in the service corridor for another 4 minutes, running the accumulated data against what he already held. The second key, a container classification with no public reference. A material that could not travel with others of its kind, not for safety reasons given the context, but for security. To prevent anyone moving one segment of the chain from knowing the whole. He had enough. He did not need Vasek yet. He replaced the panel, descended via the service stair, and walked out through the loading dock at the rear. Broad's key card went into a storm drain 2 streets away. Broad himself was in no condition to report it missing. Jill reached the transfer post at Prazow before dawn. It was a repurposed agricultural warehouse on the edge of a town that had been dying slowly for 20 years. The kind of place where remaining residents had developed a practiced incuriosity about trucks that came and went on the old farm road after midnight. The post itself was not large. 4 rooms, a cold storage unit, a server rack bolted to the wall with more care than the rest of the building's infrastructure suggested, and 7 people on shift when the incident occurred. 5 of them were still inside. She pulled on examination gloves before crossing the threshold, a habit so ingrained it required no conscious decision, and moved into the main room. Overhead lights still on, heating still running. 2 of the 5 seated at workstations positioned in front of active monitors, as though they had simply stopped mid-task. A third on the floor near the cold storage door on his back arms, at his sides, with a symmetry that no one falling achieves naturally. The 4th in the short corridor connecting the main room to the equipment closet, face down, one hand still reaching toward the door handle. The 5th she found behind the server rack. She had known from the positioning of the others that there would be a 5th somewhere requiring deliberate searching. She stood in the center of the room and did not touch anything yet. Temperature correct for the building's function. Monitors displaying active readouts. The coffee in the mug nearest the first seated figure was cold, but not evaporated hours, not days. Whatever had happened here had moved fast enough that no one had covered the 6 steps to the alarm panel on the north wall. The seated figures required a longer look. Both faced their monitors. Both had hands near their keyboards. But the angle of the first figure's head was slightly off, not slumped forward the way unconsciousness produces, but oriented with a fixed deliberateness that living people only sustain when concentrating on something specific. And the skin at his wrists where the cuffs of his jacket had ridden up was the wrong color. Not the pale of circulatory shutdown. Something darker beneath the surface, a bruising that moved in a direction inconsistent with the body's position, as though the discoloration had been set while he was upright and standing, not seated. He had been moved. Positioned. After. She crossed to him, confirmed the absence of pulse, and looked at his monitor. The screen showed the hub's internal manifest log. The last entry was time-stamped 4 hours ago. A routine clearance code entered for Cold Storage Unit 3. The cold storage seal was intact. The contents per the visible manifest were accounted for. Nothing missing. That was what stopped her. She stood at the cold storage door and ran the scene's logic backward. 5 dead. Everything operational. Nothing visibly taken. The alarm untriggered. The bodies arranged, some of them, with a care that served no survival purpose. It had not come here for the cold storage. The cold storage was camouflage, the obvious target. The thing anyone arriving would look at first, whatever moved through this post, had come for what the people inside carried. The codes, the clearances, the authorizations stored in their memory and in their access hierarchies. She pulled out her phone. Prezo is a data point, she said before Chris could speak. Not a supply hit. 5 dead cold storage untouched. It came here for entry permissions, not material. A pause. You're sure? The manifest log has a clearance entry 4 hours ago. Routine code correct format entered from the primary workstation. She looked at the seated figure. The man at that workstation has been dead for at least 6 hours. And someone repositioned at least 2 of the bodies after the fact. The discoloration pattern is wrong for their current positions. 3 seconds of silence. It used his clearances after he was already gone, Chris said. It used his clearances, his workstation, and his log entry, formatted correctly time-stamped within normal parameters. Anyone checking remotely would see a routine event. She paused. This isn't a chain being robbed. It's a chain being read. Chris was in a conference room at the Bucharest field office when the call came in, sitting across from a regional coordinator named Falk, who had been explaining with considerable patience why a formal escalation required sign-off from 2 supervisory levels and a written assessment of operational necessity. He had been listening to this for 11 minutes. Jill, he said and held up one finger toward Falk. He listened. When she finished, he set the phone face down on the table and looked at the coordinator. I need the full manifest logs for the Eastern Transit Network. Every secondary node, every transfer authorization, every cold storage clearance event, 90 days back. Falk's expression became careful. That's a significant data request. It would need to go through. I know what it needs to go through. Chris leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, precise. I'm telling you what I need, not asking you to approve it. Your job right now is to tell me who I call to make it happen in 2 hours instead of 2 weeks. Captain Redfield, the protocols exist because unfiltered access to multi-node manifest data creates significant prazow, Chris said. Falk stopped. Transfer post, Eastern Network secondary node, 5 personnel, as of 40 minutes ago. He held the coordinator's gaze. Your protocols had that building logged as active and operational as of this morning's check-in. It's been a crime scene for at least 6 hours. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Falk reached for his phone. Leon received the Prazow briefing summary at 6 in the morning. Forwarded from a DSO contact who had flagged it because 2 of the 5 dead had surfaced in a financial database he had been maintaining for a separate investigation. Procurement irregularities in the BSAA's Eastern European operational budget. A case he had been building for 7 months without a clean thread to pull. The Prazow names gave him the thread. They were minor figures, low-level documentation handlers rather than decision-makers. Their appearance in both the incident and his database was not minor, because the database entry connecting them was not about their employment at the transfer post. It was about payments to a shell company registered in Luxembourg, dissolved 14 months ago, re-registered under a different name 6 weeks later. Leon had flagged the original company during the procurement investigation and set it aside when the dissolution appeared to close the trail. The re-registration had happened after he stopped looking. The new company had acquired one significant asset, a freight authorization granting customs exemption for biological research materials through 4 specific border crossings in Central Europe. No inspection, no manifest verification. Legal passage for sealed biological containers through checkpoints that would otherwise require multi-agency sign-off. He pulled the crossing list, cross-referenced it against the transit network map Chris had forwarded 2 days earlier. 3 of the 4 crossings appeared there as nodes in the secondary lane. The 4th did not appear anywhere in the BSAA's data. He stared at it for a while, pulled the company's registration documents, found a director named Agentech-affiliated researcher officially deceased in 2009. Workplace accident file closed. Leon recognized the name because it appeared in a case summary he had read 3 years ago during an investigation into biological research data missing from an umbrella subsidiary. A footnote then. A dead end. Not anymore. He wrote 3 sentences in a secure message and sent them to Chris Forth, crossing not in your data. Exemption acquired through a company with a dead director, Gentech adjacent. Someone built a door. BSA, A, doesn't know exists. Then he poured coffee and drank it while it was still hot, which was something he had learned to do in this line of work, and began pulling the thread that 7 months of prior work had just made reachable. Vasek Oren left his office at 7:12 and took the third of his 4 alternating routes home east along the commercial strip north through the residential block west on the service road behind the district's older apartment buildings. He was 200 meters into the service road when the ambient noise changed. Not dramatically, just the particular quality of silence a street develops when something that was present is no longer. He kept walking. He had been in situations before where stopping was the wrong instinct. He made it another 40 meters. What followed lasted less than 4 seconds and was not witnessed by anyone. The service road's 2 cameras had been malfunctioning for 11 days, a maintenance request submitted not yet actioned. Mercer had confirmed this during the prior observation period. Vasek Oren had known considerably more than the chain's lower links. The 2-letter prefix, what it designated, what handling tier it required, what category of material warranted that classification. He had known that the 3rd line's primary object was not a pathogen sample. It was a containment substrate, a biological matrix engineered to function as a carrier for multiple viral strains, simultaneously stable under transit conditions that would degrade conventional samples. He had known that only 3 people in the entire structure had seen it directly, none below a clearance level Vasek himself had never reached. He had known the name of the node where it was currently held. He had not known the 2nd key. Mercer filed the gap and walked north out of the service road into the lit street. A woman walking a dog passed without looking up. A tram moved through the intersection ahead. The field team Chris dispatched to Prazov arrived 4 hours after Jill's call. 40 minutes of processing the scene before the lead investigator pulled the external access log kept on an isolated server specifically to prevent tampering. In the 48 hours preceding the incident, the post's systems had been accessed remotely 17 times. 14 were routine. 3 were not. Each anomalous entry had lasted less than 90 seconds. Each had used valid authorizations belonging to a different employee. Each had targeted a different subsystem personnel records. Clearance hierarchies, the internal communication archive. The lead investigator forwarded the log to Chris with one annotation. Someone mapped this post before entering it. Chris read it in the back of a vehicle heading toward a secondary airfield 40 minutes from a flight to the 4th border crossing Leon had flagged. He forwarded the log to Jill without comment. She would see it. The 3 employees whose authorizations had been used for the remote mapping were among the 5 dead, which meant the mapping had occurred before those 3 people were consumed, before the building had been entered physically. Whatever had done this had used them to study the post's architecture, then walked in and used them a second time to clean the visit from the record. He put the phone away. Outside fields moved past in the dark. A grain structure against the sky. A road sign he didn't read. He had been thinking of this as infiltration, a predator moving through a system consuming what it needed, staying ahead of detection. That was still accurate. But something about the remote access log made the frame feel too small. What he was tracking had not broken into the system. It had been invited in by people who were already dead. The vehicle moved on. The fourth crossing was waiting. And somewhere in the structure of roads and rail lines and refrigerated trucks threading through the continent, something was making decisions about which parts of what it had absorbed were worth keeping and which parts of the people left alive still had something it needed. Chris was not yet sure whether being followed was something it had anticipated. He was becoming less sure it was something it minded. The port district of Morova had the particular quality of a place that had been left to its own logic for long enough that the logic had curdled. The fishing industry that had sustained it for 60 years had contracted, then ceased. What replaced it was not illegal in any single jurisdiction, but was not clean in any of them, either short-term storage, third-party freight handling, the kind of documentation processing that required physical proximity to a border crossing, without requiring anyone to look too closely at what was being documented. 3 warehouses on the southern spur still operated. The rest were available for arrangement. Mercer had selected the easternmost of the dormant structures 9 days ago, while Morova itself had not yet appeared in any operational report filed by the BSAA, the DSO, or any agency with jurisdiction over biological containment incidents. The space's last legitimate tenant had vacated it 2 years prior. The electrical connection was still live, a billing oversight that had persisted through 4 quarterly cycles without correction. The refrigeration units in the lower level were functional and had been functional when Mercer arrived and introduced himself to the building systems in the only way that mattered. By the second morning, the air in the lower level had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register on a casual inspection. But the quality of the smell had shifted from industrial vacancy to something organic and closed the particular compound of a space where living things had recently been kept in proximity to each other and to conditions they were not designed for. The shelving along the east wall showed stress marks at the lower brackets, where something had braced against it repeatedly from the inside. One of the refrigeration unit's intake vents had been partially blocked, and then unblocked, the blockage material scattered across the floor in a pattern consistent with something working at it over an extended period, rather than in a single incident. He had not come to Morova to stay. He had come to find out what the material he was pursuing could do when introduced to an environment it had not been prepared for. Of the 11 people Mercer had observed moving through the dormant warehouse district over the prior week, 4 had been selected. The others had disqualifying variables, irregular schedules, close personal contacts who would notice an absence quickly, or physiological profiles that offered insufficient comparative value. The 4 who remained had stable routines, limited social visibility, and represented distinct functional categories worth testing against each other. 2 were dock workers who used the district as a shortcut between shifts. 1 was a freight auditor whose route was documented in a schedule absorbed from Vasek Oren. The 4th was a private security operative whose patrol brought him past the easternmost structure every 90 minutes, a circuit so regular it had the quality of habit rather than procedure. What Mercer introduced was not the blacklight strain directly. That would have produced results he already understood. What he used was a modified substrate, a fraction of the biological matrix described in Vasek's memory under the 2-letter prefix, combined with a carrier agent synthesized from his own biomass to stabilize it for transfer. The question he was testing was not whether it would spread. The question was whether the result would retain enough functional coherence to be useful. By the second day, he had preliminary answers. By the third, the answers were more complicated than anticipated. The dock workers had converted quickly and lost most specificity within 18 hours. Mobile and aggressive, but operationally crude, the kind of outcome useful for distraction, but not for anything requiring sustained function. The auditor had held longer, retaining enough surface coherence to complete 2 of her standard tasks before the underlying architecture became too degraded to maintain the performance. That was more interesting. The operative had held longest of all. And on the morning of the fourth day, was still running a version of his patrol route, not the full circuit, but the segment passing the structure repeated at irregular intervals, as though something in what remained of him still recognized the location as significant. That was the most interesting result. Mercer stood in the upper level at a window facing the waterfront and watched the man move through the lot below for the seventh time. The gate was off a drag on the left side, a hesitation at the turn that the original had not shown, but the route itself was deliberate. Something had survived the process that was worth studying further. He noted it. He noted that the auditor type was potentially more valuable than the worker type for operations requiring sustained infiltration. He noted that the operative type, while degraded, retained something resembling spatial orientation around a location of prior significance. Then he left because he had what he needed and the structure would not remain unnoticed indefinitely. He was 12 blocks away when the first alarm was triggered. Jill reached Mirova 6 hours after the initial containment flag filed not by any BSAA monitoring system, but by a harbor authority supervisor who had found one of the dock workers attempting to re-enter his shift facility through a wall rather than the door. The supervisor's incident report was disorganized, but contained 3 details that escalated past the harbor authority's own protocol and into a channel that reached Chris's team. The worker had not responded to his name, had not responded to pain stimulus, and had continued attempting to move through the wall for 11 minutes before anyone thought to restrain him. The response team had cordoned the warehouse district by the time she arrived. 4 individuals in custody. The cordon covered 6 blocks. She bypassed the outer line with her BSAA credentials and moved toward the inner boundary, where the response team's lead officer, a local tactical commander named Brandt, was standing at the edge of his jurisdiction, looking like a man who had prepared extensively for a situation that bore no relationship to the one in front of him. "Briefing," she said. Brandt looked at her identification, then at her, then decided not to ask. 4 individuals. 2 from the dock labor pool, 1 freight auditor, 1 private security. All presenting with the medical team is calling it acute dissociative syndrome, but that's not... He stopped. That's not what this is. No, Jill agreed. What are they doing? The dock workers are in containment and keep trying to move toward the eastern warehouse, not toward each other. Not toward the response team, toward the warehouse. The auditor is seated and hasn't moved in 2 hours, but she's been entering numbers on any surface she can reach. Fingers on the floor on the wall. The security operative is the one I want you to see. He led her to a secondary vehicle at the boundary's edge. Through the reinforced window, the man sat in the back seat with restraints at the wrist and ankle, not struggling against them, looking at the window with an expression that was not blank. Blank Jill had seen before. Blank was the absence of processing, but was instead the expression of someone doing something internally that required no external input. He asked what time it was, Brandt said. Jill looked at him. 40 minutes ago. 2 of my officers were processing him, and he looked up and asked what time it was. One of them answered they weren't sure what else to do, and he said thank you. Brandt's voice was controlled in the specific way of someone keeping it controlled deliberately. Then he went back to whatever he's doing now and hasn't spoken since. Jill watched the man's face for a long moment. The auditor entering numbers. The workers moving toward the warehouse. The operative asking what time it was and going quiet. These were not the behaviors of a failed infection. Each of the 4 was doing something not the same thing, not coordinated, but each pursuing a specific function that had survived whatever had happened to them. She leaned closer to the window. The operative's fingers had left impressions in the door's condensation. A sequence, repeating with minor variations each cycle. Has anyone checked whether those numbers match any known code format for the Eastern Warehouse's systems? She asked. Brant stared at her. We didn't know. Do that, as she straightened. And get me access to the warehouse. Turn. The easternmost structure had the quality of a space vacated carefully rather than hurriedly, which Jill recognized immediately as significant. No equipment left behind. No material spilled or dropped. The refrigeration units in the lower level were running and had clearly run for several days, but the shelving they maintained temperature for was empty, wiped down, no residue. The power cable feeding them came from an external connection, rather than the building's main panel, added deliberately removable without appearing in the electrical record. Whoever had used this space had known which details investigators would look for and had addressed each of them. She moved through the lower level methodically, not touching the shelving. The floor had been cleaned. She could read the pattern in her lamp's light, the compression marks of a cloth moving in deliberate strokes. But cleaning a floor does not clean the air, and the air held a quality she recognized from other scenes, in other cities, biological material in quantity. And beneath it, something sharper, something that did not belong to a storage space, and had not been there when the space was simply empty. At the north wall's base in the corner, where the cleaning strokes had not fully reached, she found the residue. Dark, slightly viscous, partially dried. She photographed it without touching it and straightened to look at the wall above. A mark at shoulder height. Not a smear, a sustained impression, as though something had pressed against the wall with deliberate force over an extended period. The geometry was wrong for a handprint. It had the right number of contact points for a hand, but the pressure distribution suggested the hand had been used as a brace rather than a grip. The weight behind it oriented downward and inward the way someone leans into a wall when they are concentrating on remaining upright rather than on the wall itself. She stood in the corner and understood what had happened in this space. Not an outbreak, a study. The 4 people outside were not victims in the conventional sense. They were test variables, selected for specific qualities, exposed to something, and then observed to determine what survived the process and what degraded. The space had been the laboratory. The researcher had already left with the results. She called Chris. Mirova is a controlled experiment, she said. Not a containment failure. Whatever did this chose 4 specific individuals, used them to test something, and vacated before the results could be attributed to it. A pause. The ones in custody aren't randomly infected. They're samples. Each retained a different function, access codes, navigation, temporal orientation. It was testing what survives the conversion. A silence, she read, as him repositioning his entire frame on the situation. How long ago did it leave? The cleaning is recent. 6 hours, maybe 8. We missed it by a shift. I'm 90 minutes out, he said. Don't let Brant's team process the warehouse. Already told him. Hey, Tim. Chris arrived with a 4-person team and containment protocols, updated twice during the drive, because the protocols he carried assumed a specific relationship between infected individuals and purposeful behavior, and that relationship did not apply here. Brant surrendered operational control without being asked. Chris noted this as a sign the man understood his own limits more than could be said for most local commanders in situations like this. The warehouse took 40 minutes to process properly. He spent most of that time in the lower level reading what Jill had read, arriving at the same conclusions by a different route. Not as a pattern analyst, as a soldier reading terrain for advantage, for threat, for what a space told him about the person who had chosen it. This person had chosen the site because it was invisible, functional, and disposable, because it was close enough to the freight architecture they were exploiting, but far enough from any monitored point to run an operation for days without a flag. Because it had refrigeration, which meant whatever had been introduced required specific temperature conditions. because it had only one practical entrance, which meant control over who entered was absolute. Professional site selection. Criteria-based. The opposite of opportunistic. He was crossing the upper level back toward the stairs when his radio crackled. "Captain, we have a problem at the boundary." Two of Brandt's officers were down, not dead, Jill confirmed from the radio, and the cause was the security operative who had removed his ankle restraints and covered 40 meters of open ground before anyone registered the movement. He was at the cordon fence now, both hands pressed against the chain link, looking through it at the eastern warehouse, with an attention so focused it had the quality of instrument rather than intention. Chris crossed the cordon at a run. The operative turned at the sound of footsteps. Something in what remained of him processed Chris as a new input. The head tilted, tracking, and then he moved. Not toward Chris. Perpendicular to him along the fence line, and the direction change was wrong. Not the lurching momentum of a compromised nervous system. A lateral cut executed with a precision that had no business surviving whatever had been done to this man. Weight transferred low pivot on the outside foot, using the fence post as a fixed reference point to push off rather than an obstacle to avoid. He was using the environment, navigating it, treating the fence as a tool. Chris vaulted the fence and closed the distance on the second stride. The operative cut again this time, angling toward a gap in a stack of pallets that would have let him put solid cover between them. A gap that a human moving at speed through unfamiliar terrain at night would not have identified that quickly. Chris hit him before he reached it. The tackle landed harder than it needed to, and he immediately felt the wrongness of the body under him. The wrong temperature, the wrong resistance in the muscles. The impact absorbed in a way that living tissue does not absorb the impact. He pinned the operative's arms and looked at his face from 8 inches. The man looked back. The eyes were tracking, processing. Something was still running. "Who sent you here?" Chris said. He did not expect an answer. The mouth moved, not speech. The motor system for full articulation was not intact enough, but the shape of an attempt. 2 syllables. The second was lost. The first landed close enough to a consonant cluster that, combined with the direction the man kept orienting toward, gave Chris something he had not had before, a partial word, and the direction it pointed. He held the operative down until backup restraints arrived and did not release him until the navigational function had run out of a destination to navigate toward. Then he stood, looked at the warehouse across the cordon, and considered what Jill had said. It was testing what survives the conversion. Navigation had survived in this one. Access codes in the auditor. Orientation toward a fixed point in the dock workers. And all 4 had been within reach of a site selected, used, and vacated by something that did not leave evidence where an investigator would look for it. He pulled out his radio. "Leon, location search. Outside BSAA data entirely. A facility within 200 kilometers of Morova refrigeration infrastructure, biological handling capacity, no active filing in any operational database." He watched Brandt's team approach with a second set of restraints, cross it against the 4th crossing, and the dead director. A pause. "That's a wide net. Start with a crossing. If there's a place this originated, it's not anywhere we've been looking." Leon had spent 11 hours on Point Vela before Chris's request arrived, working from an angle most searches would not attempt, beginning with the assumption that the most important information was what should be present, but was not. Point Vela had a physical location, a border checkpoint on a secondary road between 2 small municipalities with no significant freight traffic. Regional infrastructure records showed it as an active inspection point maintained by the local border authority, absent from the BSAA's Eastern European operational map, absent from the DSO's geographic risk register. Missing from 3 EU biosecurity monitoring databases Leon had legitimate access to, and one he did not. A checkpoint that existed physically but had been excised from every relevant monitoring layer was not an oversight. It was a door. He had been working backward from Point Vela, trying to establish what the exemption authorization was designed to move materials toward when Chris's call confirmed he was already on the right thread. Satellite imagery for the agricultural property east of the crossing showed a structure at the parcel's eastern edge partially occluded by a tree line grown against a former perimeter fence. Low-profile concrete construction, 2 vehicle access points, an external ventilation array on the southern face, the kind used when interior air management requirements exceeded standard HVAC capacity. No building permits filed after the agricultural holding company's acquisition. Either the structure predated the acquisition and had been absorbed into the parcel's documentation, or the permits had been filed under a different registration and cross-indexed to prevent the building from surfacing in a property address search. Both possibilities pointed the same direction. He requested a current satellite capture through a separate channel and waited. 40 minutes later, the comparison told him what he needed to know. The tree line on the northern face had been partially cleared. A new vehicle track ran from the cleared section to the access road. The ventilation array had been expanded additional units on the eastern face, not present in the 14-month-old image. Recent preparation. Increased operational capacity. Someone getting a site ready for a heavier workload. He forwarded the coordinates to Chris and Jill both and added a third recipient. A contact number he used sparingly for situations where information carried value to someone whose interests occasionally aligned with not ending the world and who would want to know. A site of this nature existed before anyone else reached it. No reply came back. He had not expected one. That was how Ada worked. The current satellite image contained one additional detail Leon had noted and not included in either forwarded message. At the northern vehicle track at the edge of the cleared tree line, a shadow with the geometry of a standing figure faced the structure. The capture was 40 minutes old. The figure could have been anyone, a worker, an inspector, a site manager with no reason to be interesting. Leon pulled it to maximum resolution and studied the shadow's proportions for a long time. The figure was not moving, not inspecting the structure from various angles, not walking the perimeter, not doing any of the things a person does when they are present at a location for a professional reason. It was standing still and facing the structure with the focused quality of something that had already decided what it wanted and was calculating how to get it. He set the image aside and filed no report. Some information moved better when it was carried quietly and released only when the direction it was heading became clear enough to matter. That moment had not arrived yet. He suspected it would not be long. The man Leon had been looking for was named Drest. And Drest had made the specific mistake of continuing to use a fuel card registered to the shell company's dissolved predecessor entity for 3 months after the company had officially ceased to exist. The card had been flagged in a routine audit routed to a financial crimes database and sat untouched for 11 weeks because the agency responsible for it was understaffed, and the flag had been categorized as low priority. Leon had found it because he had been looking at the dissolved company's asset transfer records and noticed that the fuel card was the only asset not formally transferred, terminated, or absorbed into the successor entity. Everything else had been handled with the precision of someone who understood how to close a corporate structure cleanly. One oversight in a document trail otherwise engineered to disappear. Drest drove a refrigerated transport vehicle along a route connecting 3 waypoints in the agricultural region east of Point Vela on a schedule that did not appear in any freight database but was consistent enough to reconstruct from the card's transaction timestamps. Twice weekly. Most recent transaction, 14 hours ago, 40 kilometers from the parcel Leon had flagged. He found Dressed at a roadside stop outside Mercer, eating lunch from a container he had brought from home. Leon's cover was transport insurance assessor, specific enough to be credible, vague enough to resist detailed questioning. Dressed was the kind of man who had been doing the same job long enough to be bored by it, which made him talk more than he should have. The conversation ran 11 minutes before a second vehicle pulled into the stop. A company truck, someone dressed, recognized someone who would recognize Dressed, and noticed the stranger asking questions. Leon wrapped the conversation in 4 sentences, got everything essential, and was back in his rental vehicle before the truck's driver had finished parking. Dressed did not know what he was carrying. He knew the temperature band, the written instructions, the gate at the end of the access road. He had never been permitted past. Someone always met him there. The same 2 people alternating. He handed over the sealed containers, signed a manifest he was never allowed to keep, and drove away. But he knew the gate's location. He could describe both contacts, and on one occasion, 3 months ago, arriving early, he had seen a third vehicle leaving through a second entry point on the northern face laboratory transport. Ventilation units built into the roof. Leon was on the phone to Chris before he had started the engine. The compound is active and receiving deliveries. I have a route, a gate location, physical descriptions of 2 people who work inside. A pause. And a northern entry point that doesn't appear in the satellite imagery. Chris's response was immediate. How long to the gate? 40 minutes. I'm 2 hours out with a full team. Don't approach the gate alone. Understood. He approached it alone 45 minutes later, stopping 200 meters short on a secondary track behind a stand of trees. Long lens. Gate location confirmed. 2 guards, not uniformed, not openly armed, standing in the way of people who were armed and had decided not to advertise it. And through the tree line's gap, the northern entry point Dressed had described. Beyond it, barely visible the eastern edge of the ventilation array, the satellite image had partially captured. Real, manned, operational. He sent confirmation to Chris and settled in to wait. Done. Chris had the team moving within 4 minutes of Leon's message. The briefing in the vehicle was short. Compound is live, 2-person security presence at the main gate second entry on the north face. We don't know depth of internal security or what's inside beyond temperature-controlled biological material. We go through the northern entry. He looked at the team. Jill takes the technical section once we're through the outer layer. I take the main floor. Vasquez and Kim hold the northern entry open. We are not there to clean the place out. We are there to confirm what's being held and secure it for transport. Jill, across from him, had been studying the satellite image on her tablet for most of the drive. The ventilation array, she said. What about it? Wrong configuration for standard cold storage. The eastern face units are the kind used when interior atmosphere needs to be maintained independently, not just filtered maintained. A separate pressure zone. She set the tablet down. Whatever is in the interior section is being kept under atmospheric isolation, not cold storage alone. Meaning the most protected area won't be the largest room, Chris said. It'll be the one with the separate air supply. Which also means if anyone triggers a contamination alert inside that section, seals automatically. A pause. So we don't trigger one. That's the plan. The northern entry was a vehicle gate set into a secondary fence line, constructed within the past 8 months after the most recent satellite capture Leon had been able to access. Padlocked from the inside. Vasquez handled it in 40 seconds. The team moved through 50 meters of cleared ground toward the building's northern face. 2 guards visible on the main gate, none on the northern approach by design. Leon's imagery had suggested because the northern entry had been added as an operational convenience rather than a security measure. The people who built this place had not expected anyone to know it existed. Chris put his hand flat against the north wall. Cold in the way concrete gets cold when the interior is being actively maintained well below ambient, and beneath that, the faint mechanical rhythm of air management systems running under sustained load, the building breathing around whatever it was, keeping stable. The northern entry required a keypad and a card reader. Jill was at his shoulder before he could signal. Two-factor. We need both or we trigger the tamper protocol. She moved east along the wall without waiting for his response. 4 minutes? She came back in 3, and she had not found an unlocked panel. She had found a motion sensor on the maintenance hatch's inner frame, active, correctly positioned, and connected to a log, rather than an alarm, which meant it would record their entry without triggering a response, but would leave a timestamp that someone would eventually check. She had disabled the log connection before opening the hatch. It had cost her 90 seconds she did not have to spare. North face has a maintenance hatch, she said. It's clear now. Chris moved. The maintenance passage was narrow and smelled of sealant and recycled air, lit by emergency strips someone had decided were sufficient. Jill moved through it first, reading the layout from the conduit runs overhead, heavier runs going east toward the interior. Lighter infrastructure feeding the outer areas. At the first junction, she stopped. Left standard infrastructure proportional to a building of this size, right the heavier conduits, and beneath the mechanical smell, something else. The particular compound of biological material present in quantity denser and more established than what she had identified at Mirova, as though it had been part of the building's character for long enough to become inseparable from it. She went right. 30 meters down a pressure seal. Not a maintenance entrance, the kind used when atmospheric integrity between sections was critical. Status light green, the section beyond was operational. A smear on the panel beside it. Not a fingerprint, a smear left by a gloved hand moving quickly. Fresh enough that the edges had not yet dried to the surface. Someone had been at this panel in the past hour, possibly less. Her radio clicked. Chris, Jill, status. At the inner pressure seal. Someone was here before us. A pause. I need 2 minutes. You have one. She made her decision in 40 seconds. Not because 40 seconds was sufficient, because it was what the situation allowed. And she had learned across enough situations like this that faster decisions were not worse decisions, they were decisions made with the information available, rather than the information preferred. She keyed the panel. The pressure seal opened. Ada had been inside the compound for 53 minutes when the BSAA team breached the northern entry. She had known they would come. Not the timing, the inevitability. Leon Kennedy was thorough, and the satellite comparison she had received through the channel he did not know she monitored had been more than sufficient. The only question had been whether his team would arrive before or after she finished. She had arrived with 40 minutes to spare. Workable. 3 things in the interior section held value. A server array containing the operational records of the 3rd channel going back to its establishment documentation, proving the channel existed, who had authorized it, what had moved through it. A physical sample collection, sealed units containing the biological matrix, the 2-letter prefix designated 6 total, each tagged with a handling classification, confirming they were the only existing samples of this particular substrate configuration. And the key, a biometric authorization component stored on a hardware device serving as the 2nd factor for the compound's highest security tier. Without it, the interior's primary containment unit could not be opened. She had come for the key and the records. 1 sample unit if she had time. The key had been in the facility director's office. The director had been dealt with 14 minutes after she entered through a ventilation point on the roof, a point the designers had not considered a concern because reaching it required climbing equipment. His office was now locked from the inside, which would read on any access log as the director choosing not to be disturbed buying her approximately 2 hours before anyone checked manually. Records on a drive. 40 seconds to copy. Key in her pocket. Moving toward the sample collection, she stopped. The pressure seal at the east end of the inner passage had opened, not Redfield's team. They had come in from the north, and the noise of their breach had reached her through the building's ventilation 4 minutes ago. This was a seal opening with a valid code smoothly, without hesitation, from somewhere inside the compound she had not cleared. She stepped back into a side alcove and did not move. The figure that came through wore the face and uniform of a facility technician. A young man she had passed in the outer section 20 minutes ago, noted as someone who had not looked at her long enough to register her face. The uniform was correct. The gait was not. The technician had moved with the economy of someone 6 hours into a shift and conserving effort. This figure moved with something that had learned the uniform, the face, and the route through the inner passage, but had not learned the fatigue that went with them. She had been in enough compromised locations to know the difference between a person and something wearing a person. The figure reached the sample collection and entered a code. The door opened. Inside 6 sealed units on a temperature-controlled rack, each tagged with a batch identifier. The figure examined them with the attention of something that understood what it was looking at. Not selecting randomly, but reading the batch tags, cross-referencing against something it carried internally, and choosing 3 specific units from the rack. Not the 3 nearest, not the 3 largest. The 3 from a specific production batch, identifiable by a suffix on the tag that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't consumed the right people. It left the other 3, closed the collection, turned back toward the pressure seal. It stopped. The alcove was dark. She was still. She did not breathe audibly, did not shift her weight, did not allow any of the small involuntary movements that living bodies produce when they are trying not to be noticed. The figure's head turned slightly, not toward her, toward the space she occupied at an angle that suggested it was processing something its visual input had not yet resolved. 4 seconds. The quality of attention that a very good predator applies to a space that is registered as not quite right. Then it continued to the pressure seal and through it. She waited 10 more seconds before stepping out of the alcove. Looked at the open collection. 3 units gone. 3 remaining. Looked at the direction it had gone and understood, with a clarity she did not find comfortable, what she had just watched work in a space 6 meters from her. The briefing had characterized it as a significant biological threat with infiltration capabilities. The briefing had been inadequate. She took 1 unit from the collection, not the same batch as the 3 already gone, a different configuration she had been specifically tasked to acquire, left the remaining 2, completed the record's copy, and moved toward her exit. Behind her, from the direction the figure had gone, she heard a door open onto the outer section. Then she heard the BSAA team. 90 seconds approximately before the intersection of those 2 variables produced an outcome she had no interest in witnessing. She moved faster. Chris hit the main floor from the maintenance passage with Vasquez on his left and Kim covering the south entrance. The outer section had the quality of a space recently and rapidly tidied, not abandoned, not alarmed, but cleared in haste. The kind of clearing that happens when people who know an inspection is coming have 40 minutes instead of 4 hours. 2 personnel in the outer section, compliant, looking at the north wall rather than at him. He left Kim with them and moved east through the pressure seal. Jill was already 12 meters down the inner passage, standing outside a room with a door whose locking mechanism had been overridden. Rather than broken as specific equipment, specific knowledge of the lock's design. Inside a server array. 1 terminal active, a drive port empty. "Records are gone," Jill said. "How long ago?" "Terminal's still warm. Minutes. He looked at the empty port. Then, he became aware of the sample collection indicator across the passage, a status light showing a recent entry event. He crossed to it and opened the door. 3 units on the rack. 3 gaps in the mounting brackets where 3 others had rested. 2 entry events, Jill said at his shoulder. She had pulled the collection's internal log. 11 minutes apart. First took 1 unit, second took 3. 2 separate people, the same room, 11 minutes between them. He looked at the direction the second entry had come from the pressure seal, the inner passage somewhere deeper in the compound. He looked at the terminal's empty drive port. He looked at Vasquez, who had appeared at the passage entrance. "South exit," Vasquez said before Chris could ask. "Female, red, 30 seconds ago." A pause. "Fast. Records east, 3 units direction unclear but not south." And somewhere in the building, a second intruder who had taken 1 unit and the operational records and was already gone. The emergency transfer warning appeared on every terminal in the intersection simultaneously, as though the compound had been waiting for exactly this threshold of disruption before deciding the situation warranted escalation. The automated sequence primary containment unit to be relocated to a secondary site within 6 hours, unless countermanded by the facility director, rendered in text that was very calm and very clear about what it meant. Chris read it once, looked at the empty drive port, looked at Jill. "Find the director," he said. "Now." He had 3 batches and a question. The batches were not identical. He had known this from the moment he absorbed Vasek Oren, known it the way he knew everything, from a consume not as information read from a page, but as lived familiarity, the muscle memory of someone who had handled all 3 and understood their differences without being permitted to understand their implications. Each batch had been drawn from a different production cycle of the same base matrix, the same 2-letter classification, the same fundamental architecture, but with variance in carrier stability, thermal tolerance, and the rate at which the conversion process preserved or discarded what the host had been before. Mirova had answered the question he'd been carrying since he first absorbed the classification. The dock workers' first cycle material had gone fast and gone crude. High conversion rate, low retention, useful for mass effect, wasteful for anything requiring sustained function. He had watched them in Mirova for 4 days and understood by the 3rd that they were the kind of result you built walls with, not machinery. The auditor had been second cycle. Better retention, slower conversion, higher resource cost per host. She had completed 2 of her standard tasks before the underlying architecture degraded past usefulness, worth producing in small numbers for high-value targets, not worth producing at scale. The contractor had been 3rd cycle, and the contractor had asked what time it was. That single detail, the calibration attempt, the self-diagnostic performed against an external source, had told him more than 4 days of observation, had told him about the first 2 types combined. He had run 3 additional tests with 3rd cycle material after Mirova selecting subjects who were deeply familiar with specific spatial environments, and the results had confirmed it. Each time 3rd cycle conversion produced something that remembered where it was returned to locations of significance and could be pointed at a place the way a compass is pointed at north. That was the batch worth building with. The cold chain distribution hub on the industrial margin of the port city had the 3 qualities he had come to understand as necessary: a stable flow of people and material, the physical infrastructure to maintain converted hosts at suitable temperatures, and a gap in the monitoring structure significant enough that the first signs of contamination would read as system noise rather than crisis. The hub processed refrigerated freight arriving by rail and redistributed it by truck to 47 secondary points across the surrounding region. 3 shifts, 61 workers, a supervisory structure thin enough that a new face on the 2nd or 3rd shift went unremarked. A loading bay connected directly to a rail spur, running east through the region's logistics corridor. He used third-cycle material for 4 hosts: 2 maintenance workers, 1 logistics coordinator, 1 shift supervisor. Not 4 hosts to run a facility, 4 hosts to hold the critical points. The maintenance workers kept the refrigerated section at the temperatures the material required. The coordinator maintained the connective tissue between the hub's administrative and operational layers, approving the right documentation, redirecting the right freight, ensuring that what needed to move kept moving. The supervisor held the authorization layer, access approvals, manifest sign-offs, the small decisions that a facility's other 60 workers looked to someone else to make. 4 people at 4 pressure points, and the rest of the hub continued doing what 61 workers do because no one had told them to stop. The conversion of the shift supervisor took longer than the others. Third-cycle material was conservative. It preserved what it could spend time on the architecture worth keeping, and produced results that were slower to arrive and more durable once they had. By the time Mercer was satisfied, 4 hours had passed, and the overnight shift was well underway, running with the ordinary rhythm of a place that had not yet been given a reason to run otherwise. He walked the loading bay once. The maintenance workers were in the refrigerated section running checks. The coordinator was moving between sections with her clipboard. The supervisor was at his desk, working through the night's outgoing manifests. All 4 were doing what their roles required. All 4 were holding. He left through the rail spur, moving east along the track bed for 2 kilometers before clearing the camera coverage. Behind him, trucks came and went. Manifests were approved. The hub continued its overnight operations in the hands of people who were no longer themselves, surrounded by 60 others who had no reason to notice. The first node was live. Jill had been building a composite map for 6 hours when the logic resolved. 4 data sources, incident reports from the Eastern European freight corridor, the Mirova containment log, the records BSAA forensics had extracted from the compound's secondary systems before the emergency transfer initiated, and the satellite coverage Leon had pulled on the surrounding region. Each showed a different layer. It had taken 6 hours to align them into something coherent. What she was looking at was not random. Every location that bore any mark of contact with whatever was moving through the region shared 3 characteristics. She had identified the first 2 in the day's prior stable throughput of people or material and environmental control infrastructure capable of maintaining biological material at specific temperatures. The third had taken longer to name because it was less visible than the others. Not a physical quality of the locations themselves, but a quality of their relationship to the institutional structure surrounding them. Each location sat in the overlap between 2 or more jurisdictions. The freight corridor fell between 2 national biosecurity frameworks with different reporting thresholds. The Mirova district crossed the boundary between harbor authority and municipal enforcement, with neither having full jurisdiction over the dormant warehouse zone. The compound east of Point Vela existed in a documentation gap that Leon had traced through 3 layers of corporate registration. The pattern held without exception. She wrote 3 words in her notes: flow temperature gap. Then she looked at the regional map and identified every location that met all 3 criteria simultaneously. There were more than she wanted to count, but 3 stood out within a 100-kilometer radius of the port city at the region's center, each with all 3 qualities in a configuration dense enough to serve as a node for something larger. A cold chain distribution hub on the port city's industrial margin, a medical transit depot on the coastal road, a freight rail junction at the region's eastern edge. She circled the hub first, closest to the port city's population density, most directly connected to the city's logistics infrastructure. The obvious first choice for something building towards scale. Her phone buzzed before she could reach for it. Leon. 2 words and coordinates. It's the hub. She looked at the coordinates, looked at her map. 3 seconds to register the irritation, then she set it aside and called Chris. "The cold chain hub on the port city's industrial margin," she said when he picked up. "It's a node. Leon's already tracking it." A pause. "But Chris, that's one of 3. Whoever is doing this doesn't build singly." The silence on his end meant he was already moving. "How long to the hub?" "You're closer. 20 minutes if you go now." "Going." A beat. "The other 2. Medical Transit Depot Coastal Road, Rail Junction Eastern Edge." She was packing. "I'll take the depot." "Leon's ahead at the hub, the rail junction." "I know, boss," she said. "It'll have to wait." Ugh. Chris reached the hub's outer perimeter with 4 people, and the specific disadvantage of knowing what he was looking for in general, without knowing what it looked like in practice. Whatever Mirova had produced, this was the settled version hours into a working environment, not days into an experimental one. The loading bay looked like a loading bay. That was the first problem. He split the team. Kim and Vasquez on the north and south vehicle entries, himself and Reyes through the pedestrian access on the east face. The overnight shift was visible through the wire mesh panels. Workers moving between sections, a supervisor at a desk in the elevated control room, a coordinator crossing the administrative section with a clipboard, manifests being processed, freight moving. Everything looked correct. He had spent the past week learning to treat correct-looking things with a suspicion he used to reserve for obvious threats. "Don't cluster," he said to Reyes, "and don't assume the ones moving are the problem." They went through the east entrance. The interior had a smell he was becoming familiar with, biological material in a cold environment, layered under the operational odors of industrial freight handling. Not strong enough to stop someone at the door. Strong enough if you knew what to register. The first changed host was in the refrigerated section, one of the maintenance workers running a temperature check on a rack of containers with the focused economy of someone who had been doing it for years. Chris watched through the section's wire mesh door for 30 seconds before he saw it. The movement pattern was correct. The task sequence was correct, but the man's eyes were not tracking. Fixed on a point 2 meters ahead of his hands, processing nothing external. Completing the task from memory, not observation. Chris signaled Reyes to hold and went in alone. The maintenance worker did not react to his entry, did not look up. Continued the temperature check with the methodical attention of something following a loop. Chris moved to within arm's reach and stopped. "Hey." The man looked up. The face was recognizably human. The expression not dramatically wrong, attentive processing. The look of someone interrupted mid-task, calculating the length of the interruption. Then he moved. Not toward Chris, toward the rack. The combat that followed lasted 25 seconds. The changed host was significantly stronger than its build suggested, and it was not trying to harm him, it was trying to return to the temperature check. Every movement was oriented toward the rack. When Chris interposed himself, the host redirected around him. When Chris tackled him, the host immediately began pulling toward the rack with the arm Chris hadn't pinned, and with his free hand reached back and adjusted a dial on the rack's control panel from the floor, correcting a temperature reading that had drifted 0.2 of a degree during the struggle. It corrected the reading while Chris was holding it down. He secured the restraint, stood, and looked at the panel. The reading was now within the correct range. He looked at the supervisor in the elevated control room, still at his desk, still processing manifests. "Reyes," he said into the radio, "check the temperature logs on every rack in this section. Captain, the converted in this building aren't guarding it." He looked at the corrected panel. They're running it. The whole cold chain. Whatever is stored in these racks needs the thermal conditions maintained. That's why they're here. A pause. Find out what's in those racks that matters enough to station converted hosts to protect it. Leon had identified the logistics coordinator as the most valuable contact 18 minutes before she left. He had been approaching the hub's administrative entrance with a cover that would get him to her transport compliance assessor. A role specific enough to be credible when she walked out of the administrative section, got into a vehicle that was not her registered vehicle, and drove north at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful. He followed for 6 minutes. When the vehicle turned onto a rail spur access road, he pulled over and continued on foot to confirm direction. The vehicle was already too far ahead. He stood on the access road and ran the possibilities. The spur ran north through the region's distribution corridor and connected at 2 points a secondary waypoint 14 kilometers out and the port city's primary freight hub at 17. He pulled up the secondary waypoint's profile, a small transfer station limited capacity not currently listed as active in any database he could reach. Not the secondary. She was running a delivery to the main hub. He cross-checked against the exemption authorization's permitted routes. The main hub appeared on the permitted list. The secondary did not. He called Chris. "The distribution hub is a relay point, not a terminus," he said. "The coordinator just made a run north. Spur connects to the main port freight hub." A pause. Whatever was built at the relay, it was built to feed something at the port. Silence from Chris's end. In the background, faint voices, the sounds of a containment operation finding its shape. "How long ago did she leave?" 14 minutes. "Then it's already there," Chris said. Leon looked north at the empty access road. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." In the port city's primary freight hub, a container that had arrived on the overnight rail run from the industrial margin sat in the queue for distribution processing. Its manifest listed standard biological research material, cold chain maintained, cleared under the customs exemption that had been granted to the successor entity of a company whose director had died in 2009. The clearance code matched the Regional Biosecurity Authority's format. The temperature log showed consistent maintenance throughout transit. A freight handler named Orlov took it off the processing queue and moved it to the holding section as the manifest directed. He initialed the receipt log and went back to the platform. 40 minutes passed. Then the container's interior temperature changed, not because the refrigeration had failed, but because something inside had reached a stage of process that generated its own heat, and the refrigeration could no longer fully compensate. The holding section's monitor registered the irregularity and flagged it to the system log. Orlov's radio crackled. The holding section supervisor asking him to check base 7. He went to check. He did not come back. The overnight shift continued around him. The port city slept beyond the hub's perimeter lights. The system log waited for an acknowledgement that Orlov would have provided if he had been capable of providing anything at all. The acknowledgement did not come. The log escalated the flag. The supervisor went to check. The second node had been live for 11 minutes before anyone thought to call it in. By the time the call reached a line that anyone with relevant authority was monitoring Orlov and the supervisor were no longer themselves. And 3 additional workers had come to find out what the delay was and had not come back out. Leon received the alert on his phone while he was still standing on the access road north of the distribution hub, looking at the point where the vehicle had disappeared. He read the location, read the timestamp, 23 minutes. He had been watching the wrong entrance while she drove a container to the second node, and the second node had been live before he had even confirmed the first. He got back in his rental vehicle and drove north because there was nothing else useful to do. And because the rail junction at the region's eastern edge, the third location Jill had circled, had no one moving toward it yet, and he needed Chris to understand what that meant about what was still coming. The port city's glow was visible to the south as he drove sitting above the coastal hills, the way a city's light always sits warm, ordinary, utterly unaware. That was the part that bothered him most. The port city of Vothran did not panic. That was the first thing Chris noticed when his team came over the coastal ridge and saw the lights below. Not the signs of a city in crisis, but the signs of a city working very hard at not being in crisis, which was a different thing and considerably more dangerous. The freight hub's perimeter lights were on. The port's container terminal was still running the overnight processing sequence. Trucks were moving on the arterial roads. From a distance of 2 kilometers, the whole apparatus looked exactly as a working port city looks at 3 in the morning. And it was only when you knew what to look for that you started to see the wrongness underneath it. The truck that had been sitting at the same intersection for 40 minutes. The terminal section running its conveyor system without any cargo on it. The 2 Harbor Authority vehicles parked at the outer checkpoint with their engines off and no one inside. Chris had been in enough compromised situations to know when the absence of panic was itself the warning. Reyes, what are we looking at for the main hub? Active. All systems. No alerts logged in the past 6 hours that weren't already resolved. Resolved by whom? A pause. System shows internal resolution. No external escalation. Internal resolution. The occupied staff closing their own alerts, maintaining their own logs, keeping the system reading clean, while something entirely different ran underneath. Vasquez, South Terminal. Already on it. He split the team into 3, Vasquez and Kim to the south entry, Reyes, and 2 others to the cold base section on the east face, himself moving toward the main control room on the hub's upper level. Not because the control room was the most dangerous location. It probably wasn't, but because whoever was running the alert suppression was doing it from somewhere. And the control room was the place from which a single operator could resolve a system flag without it ever reaching an external monitor. He was halfway across the main area when he understood why the place felt wrong in a way the exterior hadn't. The workers present were not doing the wrong things. They were doing the right things in the wrong way. A logistics handler in the South Bay was stacking containers in the correct orientation for the conveyor system, but 4 inches closer to the cold section's wall than the safety markings allowed. Not close enough to trigger an automated alert, but close enough to create a thermal channel between the stack and the wall. A clerk at a workstation was entering data into the correct fields of the correct form, but at a rhythm that was not the rhythm of human typing. Too regular, no hesitation, no error, and correct, no pauses for reading. A security guard at the east corridor intersection was standing post correctly facing the right direction, but had not moved in 37 minutes by Chris's count, and was not blinking at any normal interval. None of them were attacking. None were visibly impaired. They were all doing their jobs, or something very close to their jobs, in a way that would pass inspection from any supervisor not already looking for the specific tells. Chris reached the stairwell to the upper level and stopped. At the top of the stairs, a second guard, one he hadn't seen from below, was looking directly at him. Not with aggression. With the quality of attention that a motion sensor has registered tracking, waiting for an input that would determine the next response. "Hey," Chris said. The guard's head tilted a fraction of a degree. Then he turned and walked east, along the upper corridor, away from Chris, at a pace that was exactly the pace of a guard on a routine check. Chris went up fast and followed because the guard was moving toward the section where Reyes' team was heading, and whatever he was doing, it was not a routine check. The cold base section on the east face had 6 maintained areas, arranged in 2 rows, each capable of holding 12 pallet positions at regulated temperature. At 3 in the morning, on a normal shift, 4 of the 6 would be partially occupied with cargo in various stages of processing, and 2 would be empty and cycling on maintenance settings. When Reyes pushed the outer door open, all 6 were occupied. Not with cargo. With people 1 to each area seated or standing at the temperature control panels, running manual adjustments in a pattern that seemed purposeless until Reyes realized they were not maintaining a single uniform setting across all 6 positions. They were maintaining a gradient. Each area held a different temperature descending from the northernmost to the southernmost by a range of approximately 12 degrees total, and every person at every panel was making micro adjustments with the focused precision of someone calibrating an instrument. Reyes had been in bioterrorism response for 4 years. She had a functional working definition of what the infected looked like and how they behaved. None of the people in the cold bays fit that definition. "Captain," she said into her radio. "East section, 6 bays occupied. She stopped watching a woman at the northernmost panel make a half-degree adjustment and then check a reading with the attention of a lab technician. "They're calibrating something, not storing. Calibrating." Chris's voice came back immediately. "Don't approach the panels. Get the section door." "They're not threatening us." "Reyes, the door." She moved to the interior door, the one connecting the cold bays to the hub's central processing area, and locked it from the east face side. Behind her, none of the 6 figures at the panels reacted. They kept calibrating. The gradient held. Whatever they were maintaining at that differential, it was on the other side of the locked door. And the first real engagement happened at the south entry. And it lasted 4 minutes, long enough for Chris's team to understand 3 things they had not understood before. The occupied workers near the cargo lanes were not random. Each one had a role in the logistics flow that, if removed, would cause a specific disruption. The handler who cleared outbound processing, the operator who managed the way station readings, the technician who maintained the automated sealing system. Remove any one of them, and throughput dropped. Remove all 3, and cargo stopped moving through the south terminal entirely. When the engagement started, when Vasquez moved to contain the handler, and the handler stopped pretending to be a handler, the occupied staff did not all respond. 2 reacted immediately, moving to interpose themselves between the team and the sealing system. The third, the way station operator, kept working, kept entering readings, kept the throughput data flowing into the hub's central system as though nothing was happening 20 meters away. What Chris's team was fighting was not trying to kill them. It was trying to delay them. Every movement, every grab, every redirection was oriented toward one outcome, keeping Vasquez away from the manual override long enough for another truck to clear the entry. The truck cleared at the 4-minute mark, heading north toward the coastal road. A refrigerated transport vehicle with the markings of a medical logistics company. Its manifest, when Leon pulled it remotely 90 seconds later, listed temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical supplies cleared under a customs exemption attached to a company whose regulatory status he recognized immediately. "Chris," Leon's voice on the radio from somewhere north of the city. "The truck that just cleared your south terminal. I need you to know what it's carrying. Tell me, nothing on the manifest is real. The exemption is the same framework as Point Vela. That vehicle is a relay." A pause. "It's heading for the rail junction at the region's eastern edge." Chris looked at the entry. At the 3 occupied workers, 2 now restrained, 1 still at the way station, still entering readings with complete composure. "The junction," Jill flagged. "The 3rd location." "Yes." He looked at the truck's taillights disappearing around the coastal road's first curve. At the way station operator who had not stopped working through all of it. "We held the entry," he said. "You held the entry," Leon confirmed. The truck was already gone. Jill had spent the first 2 hours of the Vothran incident at the Harbor Authority's emergency coordination point. which was supposed to be the nerve center of the city's response, and was instead a room full of people trying to respond to an incident that did not match any of their response frameworks. BOW, containment, had a framework. Chemical spill had a framework. Infrastructure failure had a framework. What they were dealing with. An incident in which people were working normally, cargo was moving normally, alerts were resolving normally. And the only evidence that anything was wrong was a chain of non-response flags from workers who had gone to check on things and not checked back in, had no framework, and the absence of a framework was itself an emergency. The coordination point was not equipped to handle. She stopped using the coordination point after 40 minutes and started building her own picture from the raw data feeds. The city's monitoring system had 37 active sensors across the port's operational area. In the 2 hours since the Vothren incident was flagged, 22 had logged at least one anomalous reading. She mapped them. The pattern was not random, and it was not as she had initially assumed centered on the freight hub. The hub was a high-density area. Many sensors, many readings, high visibility. But when she removed it from the map and looked at where the anomalies were occurring in the rest of the port's operational area, a different shape emerged. The readings were not spreading outward from the hub. They were running along specific infrastructure routes. The cold chain distribution lines, the medical transfer corridors, the rail spur interfaces. The hub was not the origin point. It was the loudest point. Something was moving through the city's logistics infrastructure, the way current moves through a circuit along the paths of least resistance, which in this case were the paths designed to move temperature-sensitive material efficiently and quickly. Mercer was not attacking the city's population. He was using its supply chain as a vector. She understood then why the port city had not panicked. The population had not been targeted. The people being affected were almost entirely logistics workers. The people who touched cargo, who maintained cold sections, who processed documentation, who drove the trucks. Everyone else was still asleep, still working normally, still unaware that the system they relied on to function was running a second program underneath its regular operations. She pulled up the regional infrastructure map and overlaid the anomaly pattern. The circuit had two active points, the distribution hub and the main hub at the port's rail interface. It had a gap at the third location. She had identified the rail junction at the region's eastern edge. The circuit was not complete. Whatever Mercer was building in the city's infrastructure needed that third point to close. She called Leon. "The city is a circuit," she said. 2 points active, 1 pending. He's not trying to collapse the city, he's using it as a conductor. The third location closes the loop, and when it does, whatever is in the system has a path through the entire regional logistics network. She paused. "The truck that cleared the south terminal. Leon, tell me it hasn't reached the junction yet." 40 minutes at current speed, Leon said. "I'm 20 minutes behind it. You need to be 10. "I know." "Jill." Chris on the radio from somewhere in the hub's interior. "I need you to know something." "Tell me." "The cold bays in the east section are running a temperature gradient. 6 positions, 12-degree differential. Reyes locked the interior door." A pause that was not hesitation. It was Chris choosing words. "Whatever is on the other side of that door has been sitting in a maintained gradient for hours. I need you to tell me what that does to third cycle material." She looked at her map, at the circuit, at the junction 40 minutes away. "It accelerates the process," she said. "A gradient like that sustained, it pushes the conversion faster, more complete. Higher behavioral retention at the end because the process has more energy to draw from." She paused. "Chris, what's in the central processing area?" "Finding out now," he said. And the central processing area was a large open space designed for bulk sorting, with conveyor lines running east-west and loading bays on the south face. At 3 in the morning, it should have had a skeleton crew of 4. It had 11 people. 7 were workers who should not have been present on the overnight shift, distributed across the space at intervals that did not correspond to any handling configuration Chris had ever seen, but which did correspond, viewed from the upper observation walkway, to a rough lattice, a grid of positions covering the area evenly, each person oriented inward toward the center of the room. At the center sat a single unit, a refrigerated transport container smaller than a standard freight box of the kind used for temperature-sensitive biological shipments. It had been there long enough that frost had formed on its exterior, showing the differential between its maintained cold and the room's ambient air. The 11 people on the floor were not moving. They were holding their positions, maintaining the lattice. The 4 remaining, the ones who should have been there, were at the conveyor system's control panels, running a cycling pattern that circulated air through the room at a specific rate. A controlled environment protocol, in the middle of a sorting floor. "Reyes," Chris said quietly. "Interior door, on my mark." He went down the walkway stairs, fast crossed the space at the south edge, where the lattice had its widest gap and was 10 meters from the unit, when the guard from the upper corridor appeared from behind the conveyor line on his left. The guard moved with the economy of something that had assessed the situation and determined the most efficient response, not coming at Chris directly, angling to interpose himself between Chris and the container, adjusting faster every time Chris adjusted course. The second occupied worker peeled off from the lattice to cover the angle Chris had opened. Then a third. He put the first one down hard and fast, backed the second into the conveyor line where its mobility was reduced. The third reached him from behind, and Chris felt the wrongness of the grip. Wrong strength, wrong temperature, the particular resistance of something that had been told to hold and was holding with all the stability of a system that did not tire. He broke the grip, spun, and hit the third worker with enough force to move a person twice his size. The worker went down and got back up in a way that no person does after that kind of impact. Got back up and returned to its lattice position. Chris stood in the center of the space, breathing with 3 of the 11 now oriented toward him, and the other 8 still at their positions, and understood that he had hit all 3 hard enough to end a fight and had ended nothing. Then the unit at the center of the room made a sound. Not a loud sound. Not the kind that announces itself. The sound of something inside adjusting its position, a shift of weight, a change in orientation, the way a sleeping person moves when they are not quite sleeping anymore. Everyone on the floor stopped. 8 occupied workers. 4 at the control panels. 3 Chris had hit. All of them paused simultaneously, the way electronics pause when a power surge hits the grid. And then all of them oriented slowly, uniformly, without urgency toward the unit. Chris had fought enough to know when he was not the threat in the room anymore. He moved. He made it to the exterior loading bay door, hit the manual release, and was outside in the cold night air. When something came through the door, he had not closed fast enough behind him. Not from inside the hub, from the roof. From above. It dropped to the loading platform with no sound that registered as impact. And it straightened and looked at him with a particular quality of attention that Chris had learned to associate with things that had decided what they were going to do and were doing it. He knew the face. He had seen photographs. Mercer had been in the building, had come through while Chris was on the sorting floor, had done whatever needed to be done with the unit taken. It assessed it, extracted something from it, and was now between Chris and the bay door with the relaxed posture of something that had already completed its primary task and was deciding whether the secondary one was worth the time. "What's in the container?" Chris said. Not a question, a demand. Mercer looked at him for a moment. An earlier version, he said. "Not useful anymore." He stepped off the loading platform and walked north along the cargo lane, and Chris put 3 rounds into the mass of him and watched each one slow slightly as it hit and accelerate out the other side, and none of them made Mercer stop or stumble or change the pace of his walk. He disappeared into the lane's shadows. Chris stood on the loading platform and looked at the place where Mercer had been standing and thought about what he had said. An earlier version. The unit in the middle of the sorting floor, surrounded by occupied workers running a controlled environment protocol, had been a development stage, something set up earlier in the escalation and evaluated tonight. He had determined it was not useful anymore and walked away from it. The occupied workers inside were running a protocol for something that was no longer in the unit. Whatever had been inside was in the truck that had cleared the south terminal 40 minutes ago. He keyed his radio. "Leon." "I know," Leon said. "I'm almost at the junction." Leon had arrived at the rail junction's outer fence 2 minutes behind the refrigerated transport truck, enough time for it to pass through the vehicle gate and enough time for whatever it carried to have begun whatever it had been sent to begin. Sitting outside the fence, he looked at the site. At the truck parked near the north rail interface. At the control building lights on 2 figures visible through the window. He had a choice and approximately 90 seconds to make it. He could wait for Chris's team 40 minutes away. He could call Jill, taking time he might not have. He could approach alone, which was the kind of decision that had ended careers in circumstances considerably less complicated than this, or he could act on what he had noticed on the drive up and not yet mentioned to anyone. 2 kilometers south of the location, a secondary vehicle track ran east from the coastal road toward the southern fence. Not on any map he had checked. The tire impressions in the soft shoulder, fresh 2 sets. Same vehicle in and out told him someone else had found it. Used it and left within the past 6 hours. He got out and examined the impressions in his headlights. The tread pattern matched a high-clearance vehicle. Departure impressions were deeper at the rear than the front the vehicle had been loaded on exit. Someone had accessed the junction's southern perimeter by a route that did not appear on any standard approach map, taken something, and left. The timeline mattered. The third location had been identified 36 hours ago. These impressions were at most 6 hours old. Someone had accessed this site before the current incident escalated enough to make it a priority target. He photographed the tread pattern and cross-referenced it against the vehicle registry data pulled from the shell company's asset records early in the operation. No match in the corporate data. He ran it against a secondary database, a personal one, 3 years of logistics anomaly tracking and the vehicles associated with them. One match. A vehicle registered to a personal holding company in a name he recognized. A name that appeared in a file he had read years prior in connection with a woman who moved through dangerous situations and left by routes other people hadn't mapped. He called Chris. "Third location is compromised," he said. "The truck from the south terminal is inside, and someone accessed the junction's southern perimeter 6 hours ago by a track that isn't on any approach map. Took something and left." A pause. "They got here before the truck did. The most valuable thing at this location was already gone before the relay vehicle arrived." A silence from Chris that meant he was recalibrating. "The circuit," Jill said on the shared channel she had been listening. "If the junction was pre-accessed and the most valuable component was already removed, then what the truck delivered isn't the completion of the circuit." She paused. "It's a decoy. The circuit isn't closing at the junction. The junction is the cover." Leon looked at the site's lights, at the truck, at the 2 figures still visible in the control building doing things that looked very much like normal operations. "Then where is it closing?" Chris said. Jill was quiet for 4 seconds. "I don't know yet," she said. But Mercer just walked away from a hub that was running a development protocol he called an earlier version. He didn't shut it down. He left it running. A pause. He doesn't need the unit anymore. He's already moved to the next stage. The junction's lights continued their normal operations. The refrigerated truck sat by the North Rail interface. Leon looked at the secondary track's tire impressions one more time. Somewhere in a city that still looked entirely like itself, a circuit that none of them had fully mapped had just gone to a stage none of them had anticipated. And somewhere on a road that wasn't on any approach map, Ada Wong was already driving away from whatever she had taken toward whatever she had decided to do with it. The medical transit depot at Charing Cross sat at the junction of 3 administrative zones and belonged, depending on which form you were filling out, to the regional health authorities, the port city's emergency logistics division, or a private operating consortium that had managed the property for 11 years under a contract renewed twice without competitive bidding. In practice, this meant that no single authority had the operational picture for the whole site, and that the site's daily functioning depended on a coordination layer between 3 separate systems that had never been fully integrated. Jill had identified it as the second of the 3 locations, meeting her criteria 2 days ago. She had not flagged it to Chris as the priority target then, because the cold chain distribution hub had been more directly connected to the city's population exposure risk. She had been right about that. She was no longer sure she had been right about the prioritization. She stood at the outer fence at 5 in the morning, with her tablet showing a live feed of the site's internal temperature monitoring. One of the 3 administrative systems had an externally accessible data portal, which said a great deal about the coordination layer's security practices, and looked at what the numbers were telling her. The place had 14 climate-controlled transfer bays arranged around a central processing space. Standard configuration: 6 for intake, 6 for outbound, 2 for extended, hold-on materials requiring additional documentation. The monitoring feed showed 12 of the 14 bays running at temperatures consistent with their labeled functions. The 2 hold bays were running at temperatures that were not consistent with extended hold for any biological material category she was aware of. They were running a differential warmer at the intake end, colder at the output end, a gradient between them that matched almost exactly what Reyes had described in the freight hub's east section. Someone had built a secondary process into the hold infrastructure, using the existing climate systems, the existing documentation, the existing administrative gap between 3 organizations that would each assume the other was responsible for anomalies in the hold bays. She called Chris. "Charing Cross," she said. "Hold bays 7 and 8. They're running a process inside the hold infrastructure, not storing, processing. Same gradient configuration as the freight hub's east section." A pause. "This is the relay the truck from the south terminal was feeding. How long has it been running?" "Based on the temperature pattern, at least 18 hours, possibly longer." She looked at the numbers. "Chris, whatever is being processed in those bays has been running long enough to be producing output. If this connects to a final stage, it's been feeding it for most of yesterday." A silence on his end. "I'm 20 minutes out. Can you hold the monitoring data? Already capturing." "But Chris..." She stopped, looked at the 2 numbers on the screen, looked at the regional map she had open on a second window. "There are 3 routes out of this location that connect to a broader regional network. I can see which one is active from the temperature profile of the outbound infrastructure. If we go in loud enough to trigger a site-wide shutdown, the active route closes and we lose the connection to the final stage." "You're saying we need to go in quiet?" "I'm saying if we disrupt the wrong thing first, we close our own window." Another pause longer. "I need you to break bays 7 and 8 specifically, not the whole site. Just those 2 bays. And leave the rest running." "And leave the rest running," she said. "Which means leaving whatever is in the outbound infrastructure active until we have enough on the route to follow it." She heard him breathing on the other end, making the calculation she had already made. If we leave the outbound active, he said, and we're wrong about the route, then we've fed the final stage while we were trying to track it. She kept her voice level. I know. 20 minutes, he said, and ended the call. She looked at the fence, at the site's lights, at the two numbers on the monitoring feed that represented something being processed inside the hold bays into a form that could move through the outbound infrastructure of a medical transit site without triggering any of the three systems responsible for oversight. She had identified the right target. She was not sure she had given Chris enough time. The internal layout was not what the site plans showed. Chris noticed this within 90 seconds of coming through the North Service entrance with Reyes and Vasquez, because the entrance opened onto a corridor that the plan showed as standard maintenance access, but which had been reconfigured recently, given the condition of the walls, into something narrower and longer, with a new partition wall running parallel to the original that created a secondary space between the corridor and the hold section not appearing in any document he had been given. The secondary space was climate-controlled. He could feel it through the partition wall. Reyes, he said quietly. The partition. She ran her hand along the surface and found 3 meters in a section where the material was different, newer, less settled. She pressed, and it gave slightly the way a panel gives when it is not load-bearing and has been installed over an existing structure. Access point, she said. Leave it. He kept moving toward the hold section's marked entrance. Whatever is in the secondary space knows we're here or it doesn't. Opening that gives it the answer either way. The marked entrance required a key card. Vasquez had the site's security system partially mapped from the external access Leon had run the previous night, and the credential he produced was a clone of a valid one, which meant the system logged the opening as authorized rather than breached. The hold section had 12 transfer positions, arranged in 2 rows of 6. The first 10 held materials in labeled containers, nothing anomalous. Positions 11 and 12 bays, 7 and 8 held something unlabeled in any system Chris had access to, with frost patterns around the lower half that did not match the bay's listed operating temperature. 8 people were in the section. 6 were distributed among the first 10 positions, doing the work of managing labeled materials in a way that looked from a distance like ordinary hold maintenance. 2 were at positions 11 and 12 running manual adjustments on the climate controls with the same focused precision Chris had seen in the freight hub, not maintaining calibrating. The quality of attention that belongs to someone running an instrument, not tending a storage unit. He had learned in the freight hub that the tactical problem with this type of held worker was not strength or speed. It was priority structure. They would abandon self-preservation to protect the system they were running, which made conventional engagement ineffective, because conventional engagement assumed a target that would stop doing the thing you needed it to stop doing when you applied enough force. These would not. So he went directly to the climate control instrument for Bay 7 and found the manual override for the temperature differential. A physical dial, not a digital interface. It could not be remotely locked or system protected. He turned it. The worker at Base 7's position reacted immediately not to him, but to the control reading. She moved toward the instrument with the focused urgency of someone correcting a critical error, and she was fast enough that Vasquez had to intercept her before she reached the override. The physical interaction that followed was brief and harder than Vasquez had been prepared for. Because she did not try to fight him, she tried to get past him, and the geometry of trying to get past someone, rather than trying to stop them, is different enough to surprise people expecting the latter. While Vasquez held position, Chris turned the dial on Bay 8. The 2 workers at both positions moved simultaneously, a coordinated response that was not coordination in any planning sense, but in the way that parts of the same system respond to the same stimulus. Reyes took the second one, and the struggle at Bay 8 was longer because that worker was larger and had the particular resistance of something that did not register pain as a meaningful input. by the time both instruments were held at off-specification settings. 3 of the 6 workers from the first 10 positions had moved toward 11 and 12. Not to help the restrained ones, to continue the manual adjustments on the controls that the restrained ones had been running. Chris looked at the 3 incoming. Reyes, can you hold Bay 7's instrument alone? Yes. Then I need Vasquez on Bay 8. He moved between the incoming 3 and the controls. And I need to deal with the relay structure, not the people. The next 4 minutes were the kind of 4 minutes cataloged not by what happened, but by what they taught. The held workers' movement converged on any threat to the system rather than any threat to themselves. Their grip strength was consistent across individuals. Regardless of build, they could be redirected by engaging the shoulder rather than the arm. And none of them could be deterred by pain, but could be briefly confused by balance, disruption. The half-second gap between falling and reorienting was real and exploitable. Between the second and third incoming, Chris broke left toward the instrument panel on the east wall. The shared climate infrastructure between bays 11 and 12 ran through a single primary conduit, accessible via a bypass valve on that panel. Opening the bypass redirected the climate feed away from both bays simultaneously. He opened it with the third worker's hands on his jacket. The effect was not instant. Climate systems do not instantly change, but the change in the readings was immediate, and the 3 workers in the Section 2, Mobile 1 getting back up, stopped moving toward Chris and all oriented toward the controls, instead moving with the urgency of a system that had registered a failure it was not designed to tolerate. He let them go to the controls and walked to the door. Reyes, Vasquez, out. 15 minutes later, standing outside in the gray early morning light, Jill showed him the outbound temperature data on her tablet. The 2 hold bays had been destabilized. The gradient had collapsed. Whatever process had been running in positions 11 and 12 had lost its operating conditions and would not recover without active maintenance from someone who understood the system, maintenance the held workers could no longer provide. Because Reyes and Vasquez had removed the 2 bay position workers, and the bypass valve was physically locked open. The site's main outbound infrastructure was still active. You held it, she said. The process is down. The route is still open. That's what I needed. She was already tracing the outbound temperature data on the map overlay. The active route ran north from the transit point along the rail-linked cold infrastructure toward a terminus she had not fully resolved yet, but could now triangulate from the flow pattern. Give me 3 minutes. He looked at the workers Reyes and Vasquez had secured at the perimeter, all of whom were running the same behaviors as before, trying to go back inside, not threatening anyone, who wasn't between them and the entrance, maintaining orientation without the system to maintain. He had seen that in the freight hub too. They would run these routines until the system's cessation propagated through whatever connected them to it. How long that took was not something he had data on. Jill, he said, almost. I lost a member of the team in the hold section, he said. Kim, broken arm, possible shoulder. He's stable, but he's out. She looked up from the tablet. I know, he said. Keep going. She looked at the map for another 40 seconds. The route terminates at a point 12 kilometers northeast, she said. It's not on the map as a facility. Registered as a private research property fallow, no active filings. She paused. Leon. I'm listening, Leon said on the shared channel. 12 kilometers northeast of Sarin Cross. Private property. No filings since... She checked. Since the same period as the shell company's initial registration. I know the location, Leon said. I'm already at its perimeter. Leon had been at the property's perimeter for 11 minutes, and he was not alone. He had found the location the same way he had found most things in this operation, not by searching for it directly, but by looking at the space around the things he already knew and identifying what was missing. The shell company's successor entity had registered an asset he had initially categorized as non-operational, a private research property. Fallow, no tax filings, no utility consumption in the public record. He had set it aside because non-operational assets were rarely the active site. But utility consumption in the public record was only consumption registered to the property address. Consumption routed through the agricultural parcel's water and power infrastructure rather than the property's own connection would not appear. When Leon had looked at the agricultural parcel's consumption data for the past 8 months, the numbers were wrong in a specific way. Too high for fallow land, too low for active industrial operation. With a thermal signature, the regional utilities monitoring equipment had flagged as an anomaly and then unflagged when someone with the right credentials submitted a corrective notation explaining it as sensor drift. The notation had been submitted from an IP address associated with the shell company's successor entity. He had arrived at the northern perimeter 40 minutes before Jill's call and had been sitting in the tree line watching the structure not on any map when he heard footsteps from the east, not from the building's direction, but from a secondary access track he had identified but not investigated because approaching it would have required crossing open ground. He turned. The woman standing 8 meters away in the tree line was not pointing a weapon at him. She was holding a phone, looking at the screen, and had the posture of someone who had known he was there for longer than he had known she was there. "Kennedy," Ada Wong said without looking up from the phone. "Wong," he said. She looked up, looked at the structure, looked at him. "You got here faster than I expected," she said. "You got here faster than anyone expected." Simband. A pause, not agreement, not concession, just acknowledgement that he had correctly identified a fact. "I had better source material. The records from the compound, among other things." She looked at the structure again. 2 guards on the south face visible between the trees. Movement behind one of the ground-level windows, more than one person, more than routine occupation. "They know we're coming. Not you and me specifically, but they've been running accelerated protocols for the past 4 hours. Whatever the final stage involves, it's ahead of schedule." "Because of the freight hub," Leon said. "Because Mercer saw us in the hub and moved the timeline." She was quiet for a moment, and it was not the quiet of someone deciding whether to disagree. It was the quiet of someone deciding how much of the disagreement to share. "Because Mercer decided the city phase had served its purpose," she said finally. "The hub was already an earlier version. He said so." A pause. "Which means you have a different problem than you think." "Tell me." She looked at him, not with the expression of someone about to give something away, with the expression of someone calculating whether the exchange rate was acceptable. "The records I took from the compound document the third channel's full operational history," she said, "including the destination of every material transfer in the past 18 months. She paused. "That structure behind you isn't the final stage. It's the final relay. The materials moving through the city infrastructure aren't being stockpiled there. They're being moved through it." She looked north. 12 kilometers further, a second property. Not in any record I've seen. Not in the company structure. Registered, if it's registered at all, under a name that predates the entire shell company network by at least 3 years. Leon was quiet for a moment. He had learned over the course of this operation to run a second calculation whenever Ada gave him information, not whether it was true, but what it cost her to share it and what she expected in return. She had given him a lot just now. She was still holding the return. "You're telling me," he said, "that we're about to hit the second to last stop. I'm telling you that if you want the last stop, you need me to give you the name on the registration." She looked back at the structure, which I'll do. After you've finished what you came here to do, and after I've finished what I came here to do, which are not the same thing. He looked at the structure, at the guards, at the movement behind the window, at the secondary access track from which she had appeared. "What did you take from the junction's southern perimeter?" he said. She smiled very slightly in the way of someone who had expected that specific question from that specific person. "The key, the second factor for the final closure. Without it, Mercer can't authenticate the final stage's primary containment." A pause. "And neither can anyone else." "Including you." "Including me," she confirmed. "Which is why I need you to move fast. Because when Mercer realizes I have it, he'll make a calculation about whether retrieving it is worth delaying the final stage. And the answer to that calculation is yes," Leon said. "Is yes," she agreed. "Which gives you whatever gap exists between now and when he decides to come back for it." She was already moving toward the east, toward the secondary track. "Call your team, Kennedy. You have less time than you think." She disappeared into the tree line. He stood at the perimeter for 3 seconds running the calculation she had asked him not to run. She had given him the relay/final site distinction, the keys function, and a timetable. She was holding the final registration name. Everything she had shared was designed to make him move fast and in the right direction. Everything she had withheld gave her an exit. He called Chris. Turned. Chris took the call outside the Sarin Cross transit point, while Jill was still tracking the route. He listened without interrupting. When Leon finished, he said, "Can you verify any of it?" The utility data on this location is consistent with what she described transit, not storage. And her account of the key matches the biometric authorization component we identified in the compound records. A pause. "She's inside the structure now. I'm going in behind her when she's through." And Chris looked at Jill, who had heard the conversation. She was looking at the map, at the route terminating 12 kilometers northeast, with the expression of someone who had worked out the correct answer and just been told the problem was larger than the answer. 12 more kilometers, she said. "Is there anything there?" Chris asked. She pulled up the regional property registry, searched around the terminus point she had identified, found nothing within the correct radius under any category that matched, expanded the search, found a property registered under a land holding trust inactive since a date she had to look up twice, 'cause it was further back than she expected. The trust's registration predated the shell company network by 4 years. "There's something," she said, "but the filing is deep. If Ada has the actual registration name, it'll be faster than what I can reconstruct from public records." She looked at Chris. "We move on what we have." "We move," he agreed. He looked at his team, 3 people, 1 short after Kim. "Jill, if Ada has the key and Mercer knows it, how long before he tries to take it back?" She considered. "He'll prioritize it. Without the key, he can't close the loop at the final site. Everything he's built points toward a final closure. And if that closure requires the biometric authorization," she paused, "he'll come back for it. And when he does, he won't waste time." "How long?" "Less than we have," she said. "If we're moving, we need to move now." He nodded once and turned to Reyes. "Get Kim to the secondary vehicle. He goes to the field station." A look at the road north. "The rest of us go to the final property." Odd. The structure that was not on any map stood at the end of a service road cut through agricultural land northeast of Sarin Cross at some point in the past 2 years. Visible from the air only because the tree line on either side had not yet fully grown back. Low and concrete and utilitarian in a way that made it look like what it was pretending to be a maintenance facility for agricultural equipment. The kind of building that exists on large properties to house tractors and irrigation systems, and that people drive past without registering. Two things were wrong with it that Jill identified from the approach road. The first was the ventilation. Agricultural cover required some kind of climate management for equipment storage, but not the kind of ventilation array visible on the north face, independent units. External manifolds, the configuration she had learned to read as atmospheric isolation. The second was the access road's surface. Agricultural maintenance structures on working farmland accumulate the evidence of their use. Ruts, oil stains, the wear of heavy equipment. This road's surface was clean, maintained. The kind of surface kept clean because the things using it could not leave conventional traces. She looked at the structure from the approach road and understood that this was where the route terminated. Not a relay, not a transit point. The end of the chain. Somewhere inside, whatever Mercer had been moving through 3 anchor points, and a port city's logistics infrastructure had arrived and was in the process of becoming something that could be moved outward again. Not as individual samples or relay materials, but as a complete operational system ready to deploy at a scale that none of the prior stages had been built to sustain. She looked at Chris. "When we go in, she said. Whatever is running inside needs to be stopped before it completes the final closure. Not disrupted. Stopped." She paused. "That means finding and breaking the primary containment process, not the peripheral systems." "Can you identify it from inside?" "Yes," she said. "I'll need you to buy me time to reach it." He looked at the structure. At his team, 3 people, 1 short. "Then that's what we do," he said. He did not check his watch. There was no useful information it could give him about how much time Ada Wong had bought them, or whether she was still in the structure 12 kilometers south, or whether Mercer had already calculated the value of what she had taken versus the cost of stopping to retrieve it. He moved toward the structure, and his team moved with him. And behind them, the service road ran back toward the city, whose lights were now visible in the early morning haze, still lit, still running, still looking entirely like a city that had not been used as a conductor for something that had now moved on. And somewhere between the city and the structure on a road that did not appear on any approach map, Leon had checked Mercer was making the same calculation Ada had said he would make. Jill knew which way that calculation would go. She moved faster. The final site did not look like an ending. That was the first thing Chris noticed when they came over the rise and saw it in the pre-dawn gray, a low concrete structure set against the slope of a hill that had been partially excavated to accommodate it, surrounded by a cleared perimeter marked by sensor posts at irregular intervals. The kind of perimeter that does not announce itself because the people who built it were not worried about anyone approaching who should not be there. They were worried about losing atmospheric containment if something went wrong inside. The ventilation array on the north face was larger than the one at Sarin Cross. More units, more external manifolds, and running even from 200 meters away, Chris could see the exhaust plume against the cold morning air. Whatever the interior was managing, it required active climate work, even in temperatures this low. Jill was at his shoulder tablet in hand, looking at the same thing. "The interior has 3 sections, she said. Outer operational ring, intermediate transfer zone, and a central core with independent atmosphere. The core is where the final mechanism is running." She paused. "It has its own power supply. Taking down the main grid won't stop it." "How do we stop it?" "The cycle requires 2 inputs simultaneously to maintain closure, the biometric key, and a sustained thermal condition inside the core that the system keeps stable." She looked at the ventilation array. "If the thermal condition drops below threshold, closure fails. What's running collapses into a non-viable state. It can't restart without both inputs re-establishing from scratch. "The key Ada has," Chris said. "The key Ada has. Which means even if we crash the thermal condition, Mercer can't restart without retrieving it." She put the tablet away. "And he knows that. Which is why he's still here instead of gone. He's waiting to see if Ada brings it back. He's waiting to see if he has to take it back." She looked at him. "2 different calculations." He looked at the perimeter, at the sensor posts, at the exhaust plume. "Leon," he said into the radio. "I'm at the Eastern Service Road," Leon said. 2 transfer vehicles at the eastern access. If Mercer decides the key isn't coming and tries to move what's already inside to a secondary location, that's his route. "Can you hold it?" A pause. "Long enough." "Vasquez, north face. Reyes with me." He looked at Jill. "You go for the core. I go for whatever is between you and it." She nodded once. It was all that needed to be said. The outer operational ring had the character of machinery that had been running long enough to settle into itself, surfaces worn smooth where hands had moved along them repeatedly, lighting positioned not for comfort, but for function at specific workstations. The air carrying the compound of climate management and biological material that had become over the past week the smell Chris associated with danger that had already arrived. 8 people in the outer ring, all occupied in the way he had learned to read, not uniformly, not identically, but each with a task and a priority structure that placed the task above everything else, including the 2-person team that had just come through the North Service door and was moving through the ring with a clarity of purpose. The outer ring's workers registered and oriented toward, with the practiced attention of a system noting an input it had not been programmed to ignore. He did not engage first. He moved through the ring's western curve, keeping the workstations between himself and the direct lines of approach, looking for the door to the intermediate zone. The door was guarded. Not by one of the outer ring's workers, by something that had been placed there, which was a different thing. Placed guards were made for a purpose positioned for a function, and the figure at the intermediate door had the particular stillness of something that had been assigned to this exact location, and had been here long enough to stop needing to check whether the assignment was still necessary. Chris hit it with enough force to move the problem, and went through the door before the 2 outer ring workers who had broken from their tasks could close the distance. Reyes held the door. Chattanooga. The intermediate transfer zone was a corridor wider than the outer ring's passages, with a ceiling high enough to accommodate the vertical infrastructure running along its length. The physical connections between the outer ring's operational systems and the core's independent atmosphere. The walls had access points at regular intervals, each sealed with a pressure equalization mechanism, the kind used when the spaces on either side maintained different atmospheric conditions. Jill was already in the zone when Chris entered from the north, moving along the eastern wall with her hand on each seal as she passed it, reading them. The way she read everything for what they told her about what was on the other side. "Second point from the south end," she said without looking up. "The equalization seal is running at a lower differential than the others. The atmospheric separation between this zone and the core is thinner there. Meaning whatever the core contains is closer to this zone's atmospheric conditions at that point than anywhere else. That seal is the access point someone built for maintenance that needed to happen without full atmospheric breach." She reached the second seal from the south end and looked at it. "It's also the point where a thermal disruption introduced from this side would propagate fastest into the core. Can you get it open?" "Not quietly." She looked at him. "But I don't think quiet matters anymore." He looked at the north end of the zone, where the door he had come through was held by Reyes against an increasing pressure of outer ring workers who had abandoned their tasks entirely and were converging on the intermediate zone, with the unified purpose of a system responding to a critical threat at its center. "Do it," he said, and went back to help Reyes hold the door. What happened at the intermediate zone door over the next 6 minutes was the kind of engagement difficult to describe in terms of individual moments, because its character was cumulative rather than sequential. Not a series of discrete confrontations, but a sustained pressure applied by a system defending its center against intrusion that required the two people holding the door to trade inches of ground and seconds of position without the ability to break contact or create distance. Chris had held lines in conditions that were objectively worse in numbers and firepower. What made this different was the workers' relationship to damage. What would end a conventional engagement did not change the next worker's calculation at all, because the workers were not calculating. They were executing. The distinction between deterrence and force disappears entirely when you are dealing with something that does not model deterrence as a meaningful concept. He held the door. He held it for 6 minutes, and then the door stopped mattering, because the eastern wall of the intermediate zone opened. Not from the access point Jill had identified, from a section of wall 2 meters north of it, which had no visible seal because it did not open from the intermediate zone side. It opened from the exterior. Someone with knowledge of the site's physical layout and access to the north face had found a maintenance entry that was not in the site plan Leon had pulled because it was not in any record. It had been cut after construction by someone who needed a way in that the site's own systems would not log. Ada had known about that entry before she arrived. She had identified it from the compound's operational records, the maintenance logs from the site's first year, which specified an external cut added to accommodate equipment too large for the standard access points and never officially registered as a permanent modification. She had also identified from the same records which of the intermediate zone's equalization seals had been installed at a lower differential rating than the others, and why, and what that meant about the thermal propagation geometry of the space beyond it. She crossed 12 meters of intermediate zone at a pace that was neither rushed nor casual, reached the second seal from the south end, and looked at Jill. "How long do you need?" she said. 2 minutes, Jill said. "Maybe less." "You have 90 seconds. Ada looked at the seal. "After that, the core will have registered the atmospheric change and will attempt to compensate. If it compensates successfully, you lose the window." Jill looked at the seal, looked at her tablet, looked at the seal again. "If I do this wrong..." "You won't," Ada said. "Not encouragement, assessment. You've been reading this system for a week." She stepped back from the seal and turned toward the northern end of the corridor where a different kind of problem had just arrived. Mercer came through the intermediate zone's northern access. Not the door Chris and Reyes were holding, but a second entry on the north wall that had not been on any plan, because it had not existed until he made it exist the way things exist. When what is making them does not have the structural limitations that determine what is a wall and what is an opening. He looked at the corridor, at Chris and Reyes holding the door, at Jill at the seal, at Ada standing between him and the seal, with the posture of someone who had expected him and had made a decision about what to do when he arrived. "The key," he said. "I have it," Ada said. "You already know that." "Give it to me." "No." He looked at her for a moment, the quality of attention that Chris had spent a week learning to read, the one that meant something had been decided and the decision was being executed. Then Mercer moved and Chris moved, and what followed was not a fight in the sense that a fight is two parties attempting to overcome each other. It was an obstacle problem. Mercer had identified the seal as the critical point and was moving toward it with the efficiency of something that had removed all other considerations from its path calculation. Chris was in the path. The relevant question was not whether Chris could stop him, but whether he could make the calculation expensive enough. He went down on the first exchange. not from a single blow, from the accumulated force of something that hit, with the weight of a body that did not manage its own momentum, the way human bodies do, that transferred impact differently than bone and connective tissue transfer impact that did not slow for the kind of follow-through that human fighters learn to modulate. He got up. He knew on his feet the second time that he could not hold the position for 20 seconds. His left side was wrong in a way that meant either a rib or something adjacent to a rib. And his footing on the intermediate zone's floor was not what it needed to be for the kind of engagement this was. He knew this with the particular clarity that comes from years of doing exactly this kind of calculation in exactly this kind of moment. And the calculation said 17 seconds at best, probably 15. He threw himself back into the path anyway, because the question was not what he could hold, but what Jill needed, and the gap between what he could give and what she had asked for was 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was something he could find somewhere. He went down again, got up again, made himself an inconvenient object in a corridor for 17 seconds. "Jill, how long?" 20 seconds, she said, and then 5 seconds later, "Done." He moved. The seal on the second access point from the south end broke open faster than Jill had expected. The equalization differential was lower than its specifications indicated, which meant the atmospheric separation was thinner than the records showed, which meant the breach propagated into the core's environment in 11 seconds, rather than the 14 she had calculated. And the temperature monitoring in the core registered the incursion and attempted compensation 3 seconds before she had been prepared to account for it. The cut above her left eyebrow came from the seal's edge when she was forced to adjust her position mid-sequence to compensate for the early propagation. She had been positioned for a 14-second sequence and had to move her hands for an 11-second one, and the seal's edge was where her face happened to be when the repositioning happened. She completed the disruption. The thermal condition in the core began its collapse toward threshold. The mechanism running at the core, what had been 14 seconds from the state Mercer had spent 3 weeks building toward, became the thing that was failing. Everyone in the intermediate zone stopped. The outer ring workers, the people at the door. Mercer 3 steps from the seal with Chris between him and it. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. Then Mercer looked at the seal, at Jill, at Ada, who had moved toward the exterior entry at some point during the previous 30 seconds. "How long to restart?" he said. The thermal collapse would take between 4 and 6 hours to reach a state where the cycle could not be recovered. Restarting required the key and a thermal environment that would take at minimum 48 hours to reestablish from current conditions. The key was no longer in the intermediate zone. Mercer looked at Chris. Chris looked back. His left side was bad, and he was standing in a way that meant he knew it. "Next time," Mercer said, and went through the outer wall. Leon held the Eastern Service Road for 11 minutes. The 2 transfer vehicles had been loaded before he arrived, materials from the outer ring's secondary storage, not the primary mechanism, but part of the broader network infrastructure Mercer had assembled over the past 3 weeks. Stopping the loading was not possible. It had been completed before Leon reached the perimeter. Stopping the vehicles from leaving took 90 seconds. Specific components, specific effect. Both vehicles intact for forensic processing, neither capable of extraction. The outer ring workers continued loading into immobile vehicles for 4 minutes before the signal from the interior site reached them and changed their orientation. In those 4 minutes, working from his rental vehicle at the edge of the service road, with the vehicle's security lights cycling uselessly in his mirrors, Leon transferred what he had to 3 separate secure channels. First, the DSO. Standard Protocol Accountable will generate a report that will be filed and reviewed and actioned through the appropriate chains over the appropriate timescale. Second, an international biosecurity oversight body that had never been given cause to look at this particular corner of the freight world. They would look now. Third, a journalist. This was the one he paused on, not because he was uncertain about whether to send it, but because he understood what it would do. The journalist was thorough careful and had spent 3 years covering the intersection of biotech procurement and state security funding. What Leon was sending her would be the most significant story of her career. And when she published it, the fallout would reach organizations that did not have clean hands in this matter, including some that operated under flags Leon was professionally obligated to treat as friendly. He sent it anyway. The confirmation receipt appeared. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the ventilation array whose exhaust character had changed. The interior load was no longer what it had been. He called Chris. "The vehicles are immobilized," he said. "Secondary materials are still in them, and the network records are out. Multiple channels, past the point of suppression." A pause. "How's the site failing?" Chris said. His voice had the quality of someone still assessing what the past 20 minutes had cost. "Jill got there, with seconds to spare. And Mercer, gone." A pause that was not casual, not dead. Gone. Leon looked at the road. Ada, also gone, with the key. He sat with that for a moment. "Right," he said. Started the vehicle, drove east. The site failed over the following 4 hours. The way climate-dependent biological systems fail when their operating conditions are removed, not catastrophically, but incrementally, each subsystem losing coherence as the thermal foundation it required collapsed and could not be restored. The outer ring workers moved through 3 distinct behavioral phases as the signal from the core degraded first the maintained task orientation of the past days, then a disorganized echo of it, then a cessation that was not quite stillness, the residue of something that had been running long enough to leave grooves in behavior, even after the source was gone. By the time the BSAA containment teams arrived, the cycle in the core was in a state the team's senior analyst described in her field report as non-viable for recovery under current conditions. The materials in the 2 immobilized eastern vehicles required specialized handling. The outer ring required full biochemical sweep. The core required technical assessment that the field teams documented and escalated, but could not complete on site. The documentation Leon had sent was by the time the first containment team arrived already moving through systems and inboxes that would generate consequences according to their own schedules and their own logic. The closure that Mercer had spent 3 weeks building had not completed. This version had not completed. Chris sat outside the site's northern perimeter on a concrete barrier and looked at the ventilation array, which was no longer running. His left side had the particular ache of impact taken through adrenaline that was now receding. He was counting in the approximate way that becomes habitual in this kind of work. The members of his extended team and what the past week had cost them. Kim's arm, Vasquez's shoulder from the door engagement, 2 others with less visible damage that would show up in the weeks after. Jill sat beside him, holding pressure on the cut above her left eyebrow with a folded piece of gauze. "We stopped it," she said. "This version," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes, this version." He looked at the array. "The key. Ada has it, which means no one Mercer can currently access has it. Which means the mechanism can't restart in under 48 hours under any conditions we understand." She paused. "That's not the same as it being safe." "No," he said, "it's not." They sat with that for a while. The morning light was strengthening, and the site's concrete looked pale and utilitarian in it, just a place with a failed system inside and a significant number of complicated questions around it. "What do you think he does now?" Chris said. Jill considered. "He adapts," she said. "He finds what's usable and builds again, slower, with the information he's gathered about what we can do and how fast we can move." "Mama." "And the next time?" She did not answer immediately because there was not a good answer that was also an honest one. "The next time," she said, "we'll know more about what to look for." "That's not very reassuring," Chris said. "No," she said, "but it's accurate." He looked at the array for another long moment. Then he pushed himself up from the concrete barrier and walked toward the containment team's staging point because there was work to do, and the ache in his left side was not going to prevent him from doing it. 300 kilometers north, at a border crossing that handled a moderate volume of commercial traffic, on an ordinary morning, a health screening officer named Daniel processed a queue of travelers with the practiced efficiency of 7 years in the role. He was good at his job. He remembered faces. He noticed things the traveler whose documentation was correct, but whose posture was wrong. The bag packed differently than claimed the detail slightly off in a way that 7 years of attention had made him able to identify before he could name what he had identified. He processed 43 travelers before he reached the 44th. The 44th had correct documentation, correct posture, the right answers to the standard questions. Daniel looked at the face and found nothing wrong with it. Found nothing wrong with the bag. Found nothing wrong with the answers. Stamped the documentation and moved to the 45th. There was one thing he did not check because it was not in the standard protocol and not the kind of thing anyone had told him to look for. He did not check whether the person behind the documentation had in the previous 72 hours been inside a low concrete structure in the agricultural northeast, where something had been within 14 seconds of completing a process that had never been completed before. The 44th traveler walked through the crossing and continued north, and the morning continued its ordinary progression, and there was nothing to indicate that anything unusual had passed through, except the very small detail that the 44th traveler at no point in the 14-minute processing interaction had blinked at the rate that human eyes blink when they are tracking attending and thinking. Nobody noticed. Somewhere else, not yet locatable, not yet part of any report or documentation vein, a drive containing operational records registration data and a 14-month log of biological material transfers, sat in a case that could not be identified as anything other than ordinary luggage by any scanner currently deployed at any transit point in the region. The case was in motion. Its owner was thinking about two things simultaneously: the value of what she was carrying and the nature of the person who would eventually ask for it back. She had dealt with a significant number of dangerous people in a career that had required her to develop a practical understanding of what dangerous meant in specific contexts and how it translated into specific actions. Alex Mercer was dangerous in a way that did not translate well into the categories she usually worked with. Those categories assumed that dangerous people operated within some framework of self-interest that could be predicted and therefore navigated. His framework was legible. It had a logic, but the logic was one she found genuinely difficult to anticipate, because it was not bounded by the same assumptions about loss and cost that bounded every other dangerous person she had encountered. In an intermediate corridor the previous morning, she had watched him decide in approximately 4 seconds that a closure he had been building toward for months was worth sacrificing in order to preserve the conditions for a future attempt. The decision had been made without visible distress and executed without remainder. A person who could make that decision that cleanly was not a person who was going to let the second factor remain in someone else's hands indefinitely. She looked at the case. She was not, she decided, going to let that become her problem today. Today she was going to put distance between herself and the northeastern agricultural region, and she was going to deliver a portion of what she was carrying to the person who had contracted for it. and she was going to retain a portion that the contract did not specify, because it never hurt to have something the other side did not know you had. The case stayed closed. The distance grew. The morning continued unremarkable in all directions.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.